Band 3. Up next on American History TV, from a conference titled The National Security State and JFK, historians, authors, and former Congressman and presidential candidate Ron Paul explore the consequences of what they call America's security state since the end of World War II. Topics include the military-industrial complex, President Kennedy's relationship with Mary Meyer, wife of CIA agent Cord Meyer, and a theory linking CIA spy master James Angleton to Lee Harvey Oswald and JFK's assassination. Former Republican Congressman Ron Paul shares his thoughts on national security and secrecy in the government now. This 3-hour session was part of a conference hosted by the Future of Freedom Foundation.
All right, here we go. Michael Swanson is the founder and editor of the financial website wallstreetwindow.com, where he writes about the financial markets. Before founding that site, he co-managed a hedge fund from 2003 to 2006. Swanson has a master's degree in American history from the University of Virginia and has written works of 20th century American history, including Danville, Virginia, and the Coming to the Modern South, and one of the greatest books you'll ever read, The War State, The Cold War Origins of the Military-Industrial Complex and the Power Elite. He is currently working on a book covering the beginning of U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War from 1945 to 1963. And I'll tell you just a little personal anecdote. We get a lot of books at the Future of Freedom Foundation that people send us to look at and review and so forth. And so when I got The War State from Mike Swanson, I didn't know who he was. And so I thought, well, it's just another one of those books. And I start to stump through it, and I was just stunned. And I start really looking through it, and I take it home that night, and I was just overwhelmed with what the power of this book. And so I contacted him, and we later met at a conference in Pennsylvania on the JFK assassination, and we've become good friends. And I can't recommend this book too highly. And in fact, he donated several copies, so most of you have this book in your packets, and that's compliments of Mike Swanson. The title of Mike's talk is "What is the Purpose of the National Security State?" Michael Swanson.
Well, thanks for that kind introduction, Jacob, and it's a great day to be here for everybody. And we all have read many of the same books and studied each other's books and works, and even talked on the internet at times on Facebook, or watched each other's YouTube shows for that matter. I was thinking about that walk to Taleb, and it's real relevant for this topic because in that interview they talked about the national security state and the decisions to intervene in other countries, and why the people who make these decisions never seem to disappear or get fired or anything. And Taleb's answer in this interview is because they have no skin in the game, and that's one answer. I'm going to try to provide an additional answer to it, but that's not to say I disagree with everything Taleb says. He's someone I actually have been influenced a lot by. But a lot of studying a topic like this, I think, is about asking the right questions and going from deeper questions as time goes on. So the question that's kind of, when I wrote the book you have in your hands, I was focusing on the idea that the United States had become an empire, basically, after World War II. And if we flip to this statement right here, this is David Petraeus, February the 1st at the Armed Services Committee. Essentially, he's not saying the word empire, but he's sort of stating that we have an international order that we seek to maintain, and if we stop doing so, he states, it will collapse, and obviously there will be, he implies bad consequences to that. Now, so that's his answer. And what I want to do is go through, in this presentation, one of the things I'm going to do is show what people such as Petraeus in the past has said the purposes of the national security state is. But the question that's actually kind of gripped me over the past couple of years is, how does this thing actually work? How are the decisions in it actually made? And I don't think it's simply people don't they can make mistakes and they're not punished. But there is a repeating pattern of the type of decisions that seem to result. And the last presentation you heard with Doug Horn, he spoke about Operation Northwoods, and you hear something like that, and you can think of other events that we don't know all the circumstances of, or events that we do, and wonder what the heck is going on. What are these people thinking? And I'm going to try to give them their argument in this presentation. And one of the things when you research stuff, you'll dig something up and you'll say, what in the world is this? And this has a name to it. It's just like, this is like out of Dr. Strangeglove or something. So there's something called Project Control. It was a study done by the Air Force in the time period 1953-1954. And I'm going to use this as a case study and come back to it at the end of the presentation. But what this was at the U.S. Air War College. There was a colonel, Raymond Sleeper, who was taking classes, getting his doctorate, and he did a dissertation on air power and how to win the next war that the Air Force might fight. And he looked back at World War II, World War I, and so forth, and he wanted to make the next war one that the Air Force would win for sure. And he came up with this idea of Project Control. And what it was to go to the Soviet Union, and at the time they had a huge disadvantage in nuclear weapons in regards to the United States. They didn't have any nuclear missiles that could reach the continental U.S. They only had a handful of bombers that would have had to refuel to make it back. It's dubious if they would have been able to drop anything. So we had a huge advantage in the 50s and to continue to the mid-60s really. And his plan was, okay, we'll go to the Soviets. We want them to surrender. This is a plan to win. So we will do intensive overflights over the Soviet Union at first to kind of intimidate them and scare them. And then we'll drop a couple bombs. And then we'll issue them an ultimatum and tell them, you better surrender now. And then if they don't, we'll stop dropping atomic bombs until they do. Sort of heightened up version of what happened to the Japanese after World War II. Now, what was interesting about this study is it went up to, this is a guy just doing a dissertation, and it goes up to the top levels of the Air Force, and they hear about it and they get all excited, and they say, "Oh, this is not just a dissertation. We're going to devote huge resources at the U.S. Air War College to make this a workable plan." They even got people in the CIA to work on it, people from outside the Air Force, so even civilians, about 100 people. They spent a year working on it, and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff told them he liked the idea, and he briefed Allen Dulles, John Foster Dulles, the Secretary of Defense, Wilson, and it was mentioned in two National Security Council meetings. You can read them in the Foreign Relations of the United States series. They don't use the word Project Control in the minutes, but in the two latter meetings I have listed right there, it's discussed. What should we do? The two topics are, what should we do about the Soviet Union at this point in time going forward? It's President Eisenhower with his top national security advisors and Joint Chiefs of Staff and so forth, the chairman, and they debate, should we just bomb them? Should we do a first strike in the guise of this Project Control? And interesting enough, John Foster Dulles argues no. And I find that interesting because, in the public imagination, he's the one associated with rollback, nuclear retaliation, and so forth. And he says, no, this is a bad idea. And his reasoning is that he says this would be strategically pointless, that we wouldn't really win anything out of this. And then he talks about Eastern Europe, and he says, we really don't even need to roll back in Eastern Europe, which is amazing because this is the guy that, in public is saying this all the time. And his argument is that, well, if Eastern Europe, if we roll them back, we're not really going to get anything because the Soviets are still going to be there. And in 5-8 years, they'll have nuclear weapons. And so there's really nothing to gain. We'll just keep Western Europe. So there was a point of this is over a month period inside the Air Force, and I'm not saying the entire Pentagon was on board of this or the entire Joint Chiefs of Staff, but inside the Defense Department and the Air Force, there was, a move to get a program like this trickled up, and it got, briefed to the people at the highest levels, and it gets rejected. And Eisenhower, I think, at that, nothing like this ever comes up again, as far as I know, from looking at these documents. Now, all this sounds wacko. I mean, really. I mean, it's so crazy. John Foster Dulles rejected it. So, but in reality, what I'm trying to figure out, and I'm going to show you my answers here, is how do arguments like this make sense to these people? How does something like Operation Northwoods or this Project Control make sense to people in the national security state, or at least some of them? Now again, that's the book I wrote, and just want to emphasize that to go back to the David Petraeus statement, what I touch about in the book is really the creation of the American national security state after World War II up to the end of the Kennedy presidency, and it didn't exist before World War II, and now we take it for granted. It's an everyday part of our lives. It's the question on TV is going to be soon: should Donald Trump, our president, send troops to Afghanistan? So it's always about where should we intervene next, basically. And if you go back though to the Petraeus statement, if you just look at the simple logic of it, he seems to suggest that if we don't maintain order throughout the world, then everything will collapse. So that would imply that intervention or some sort of aggressive foreign policy is necessary. And I think that's the real purpose of the national security state. Now, there's other purposes to defend us, let's say, against China. I don't know what the odds of them attacking us tomorrow are, or defending us against terrorism, which has got a slightly higher odds, but on an individual basis, it's not very likely. And then you have to wonder, what are the costs of intervention? Is this just does the interventions themselves create the terrorism that we hear about now almost every week somewhere in the world? So I would assert that fighting terrorists or stopping terrorists is an objective of the national security state, but it's not the primary objective. The primary objective being basically to maintain its view of international order, or I would say world order. But I think that a result of that is you end up creating essentially endless wars. The funny thing, though, is you study these topics, and if you look at something like CIA regime changes in the 1950s in Guatemala and Central America and Iran and elsewhere, you can conclude, well, what's the purpose of the national? If you ask yourself, what's the purpose of the national security state? If you look at those operations, you might say, well, it's to protect United Fruit Company, it's to protect the oil interests in Iran, it's maybe to protect the clients of the Dulles brothers who were running the CIA at the time. And if you go to the Vietnam War and you read about Laos and Cambodia, you can find books about drug smuggling of heroin out of those countries. There was drug smuggling in the United States during the Nicaraguan War, the Contra covert operations. And you might think, well, it's all about drug smuggling. People are making money from drugs, and maybe there's a whole deep state involved in doing that. Or is it about just simply the purpose really about the defense industry and making profits for General Dynamics and Raytheon that are just up the road here, and getting them to give campaign contributions to congressmen to give them more contracts and so forth? These are, I think, side effects of different historical periods of, you call them war operations, covert operations, national security state operations. But I can't find any evidence though that any of those things motivates the people I'm looking at, primarily in the Pentagon, that are making decisions or making proposals, that I don't think they care, those people, about any of those things. And I think those are really the people at the top of the national security state, the most important people running it. But it's become so much a part of our life. If you look at this conference that we're at now, we're in the Fairfax, Virginia area, and it's kind of ironic because the CIA headquarters is in Fairfax County, the National Counterterrorism Center is in Fairfax County, Fort Belvoir is in Fairfax County, which is the headquarters for Army Intelligence, which is actually larger than the Central Intelligence Operation. Now, in the history of this county is tied up with the national security state and the American economy. In 1950, there were 100,000 people living in this county. In 1955, 65,000 people were employed here. 31,000 of them worked for the federal government, 11,000 for the Central Intelligence Agency. In the 1950s, there was a complete boom in the defense industry and really the national security state, tied in with an arms race, which was really non-existent, with the Soviet Union, which I'll talk about in a minute. But during that boom, the population of this county tripled. And then in the 1960s, under the Vietnam War, it doubled again. So the health of this county, or the economy of it's directly tied into the national security state and interventions overseas. Now, the funny thing about that is if you look at average income per person in the United States, rank it by counties, this county is number 2 in the entire country. Number 1 is Loudoun County, which is a neighboring county to this one. I guess that's where all the bosses work at. But for the rest of the country, there are, in the world for that matter, there's cost to all this. I would say the history that we're studying, or most of us in here are very interested in regards to the Kennedy era, is a direct consequence of the rise of the national security state. And I would say, to just put it real simple, political instability of the 1960s and 70s, whether you want to look at political assassinations or simple riots in the streets, anti-war marches, whatever you want to look at, it's political instability. And then the debts during that war piled up. In 1967, they got to be so large that there was a crisis. 1967 was really a crisis year for the national security state that really hasn't been studied in that way. But hopefully someone will pick up that project. But what happened was it became clear in the summer of 1967 that they weren't winning the Vietnam War, and at the same time riots in the ghettos across America were breaking out, and at the same time gold was fleeing the vaults of the United States and flowing into Europe. And there's a quote where the head of Army Intelligence is writing to a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and saying the American empire is in crisis because of these three things I just listed. So the people running this knew, this was kind of cracking up, and and then we had Watergate, the Church Committee hearings, the House Select Committee of Assassinations, attempts to reform, some successful probably, some not, but they were there. But today, then we had the Reagan era, and he ran for president on making America great again and turning the page on these times of troubles. And for much of the country, I think he succeeded at that. The economy boomed, the stock market boomed, and so forth. But now here we are today, after 9/11, after more endless wars, a seeming return to some strange fashion of political instability, where we have the media on TV comparing Donald Trump to Richard Nixon and so forth, and just crazy times. And everyone, I think, no matter what side of the political spectrum you are on, everyone feels like that on all sides of it. But probably nobody, if I could recommend one book about this topic, I'd recommend David Stockman's book, The Great Deformation, on the topic of the costs of all this. Now I'll go return to statements of some of these national security officials on the purposes of the national security state. This is from the Pentagon Papers, written in 1967, again, that year of crisis. And Robert McNamara commissioned them to go and look, what are the reasons we got in this war? And he came back, he got this answer back from the guy that was in charge of the paper. 70% of the reason was to simply avoid defeat, and only not to help a friend, that wasn't on the list. 10% to help South Vietnamese determination, in other words, to help that government survive. 20% to keep South Vietnam out of the hands of China. Well, what the statement shows is that, to me, is that the reasons for continuing the war were simply to continue the war. But that might, I'm not. But why? Why is it necessary to simply continue this? And I would say, skipping ahead a little bit, but I would say that they have a fear, and I'll show you the quotes on that in a second. But there's a fear that if any element of the national security state were to pull back from a war or a confrontation, or even pull bases back, that's a sign of what they call provocative weakness. And that's a statement you can find in national security speeches and documents. I've got a quote I'll show you in a second of Donald Rumsfeld saying this at his retirement speech. And with John F. Kennedy, that's essentially what he was doing. He was pulling back from confrontation with the Soviet Union in the last year of his life, and his famous peace speech and so forth, and from the Vietnam War, and even trying to limit the defense budget. But he explicitly, in his peace speech, said, we don't want a Pax Americana, which is a complete repudiation of basically saying we're going to maintain order around the world through the use of nuclear power and our weapons. But to think about the Vietnam War, though, for Kennedy himself, he sent advisors there in 1961, and it was primarily in his goal. You could describe it as a nation-building project to help the South Vietnamese defeat an insurgency and develop their nation. He was skeptical of whether it would succeed, but that was the mission he sent people to do. And the idea was, you're going to have about 15,000 advisors over there, and these are trainers. They're going to stay by the end of his term. He put in writing they're staying till 1965, and that's going to be their mission. But for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who really pushed Kennedy to intervene in Vietnam in the first place, they didn't see Vietnam as a nation-building project at all. They saw it as primarily competition with China, that China was the dominant power in Asia, and they were going to grow and influence into Southeast Asia in their view. And it was going to be between the U.S. and China who's going to be the big bad player in Southeast Asia, and they were determined it would be us. And this shows up first, this type of thinking, actually in this August 1954 meeting of Dwight Eisenhower. There's a discussion about China after Dien Bien Phu fell, which was the French effort there. And they were talking, what do we do now with China and in Vietnam? And the same proposals came up. One question was, well, should we just bomb them? They said, no, we're not. Eisenhower, no, we're not going to do that. And they basically settled on the idea: we will give them threats. We will tell them if they go into another country, we will bomb them. But we will develop and defend South Vietnam and Southeast Asia. So that was the initial genesis of U.S. direct involvement in South Vietnam, and Eisenhower sends a very small handful of people over there. The CIA, of course, helps Diem, who's the South Vietnamese premier, get a foothold in power and maintain it, and the whole effort ends up collapsing by the end of Kennedy's era, at least Diem's rule, and it becomes a militarized operation completely by the time Lyndon Johnson is in there. But the point is that China was the big thing, and in their view, the Joint Chiefs of Staff view wasn't, we're going to go develop this country. It was, okay, who's going to rule the world, really, in this part of the world, the U.S. or China? And Vietnam, that's what Vietnam was about for them. And in fact, Robert McNamara himself wrote a letter to LBJ basically saying this is the reason we got involved here in the first place, this China issue. And his national security advisor, McGeorge Bundy, in early 1965 wrote a famous memo telling LBJ he needed to intervene in South Vietnam more aggressively and bomb, and he had China also as the main reason. And he said in this memo that he didn't think we had a better than 50% chance of even winning, but it would still be worth doing to show China how serious we were about using military force. So if we look at really the founding document, I think, of the Cold War, it's NSC 68, written in 1950. It was a lobby effort, really, by the Secretary of Defense and Truman, or Secretary of State, and Truman was uneasy about even signing it. Because what they were aiming to do and what they did with this document was justify the huge arms race of the 1950s. And that line in the document, though, at the end shows me that it's more than about the Cold War, communism. It's again about maintaining order around the world. And in this document, they weren't looking to they were looking to contain the Soviet Union and China and communism, not looking to do first strikes or even rollback. But this key line, though, justified treating every other country in the so-called third world, any neutral country, as an enemy if they're not an ally. So they didn't allow neutrality, and that kind of justified the CIA to. Is it working? I'm not sure. Is it the battery, or should I just talk loud? Or okay, I'll just do that.
National security state.
Yeah, no, you never know. Well, to give you an example, to go back till today, I'll jump to. Okay, thank you. Thanks. to go back and relate this to today, because the national security state didn't go away; it's still here with us. A buzzword used today is full spectrum dominance. You see that in Pentagon papers. There was a Pentagon paper written after 9/11. Which was a document similar to NSC 68, like a strategic overview. This is what we're doing, and it's called, I think, Vision 2020, and it was the first document to use this line, full spectrum dominance, in it, and this is the definition of that according to the Department of Defense in a dictionary I found just a entry just a couple weeks ago. But to make a long story short, what they assert is they want total control, basically, of any potential battlefield on the planet, including your cell phone, for that matter, and the computer. So, and now we have information wars. If there's anything going to come out of the controversy of Russia and Trump and what did Trump do, one side effect of this is going to be an intensive focused by the Pentagon on information wars, which really hasn't been there at all. I was watching a hearing about the CIA report that came out, whether whether Russia intervened in the election or not, and the whole hearing was mostly about we need more money to start doing this ourselves, and build a base in NATO to do this in Central Europe. So that was really an interesting thing. Now, another key phrase, which I used earlier, is provocative weakness, which really I think applies to the Kennedy era and what some members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff had seen as a problem with Kennedy, and that's that any weakness could be interpreted as provocative by any potential enemy, and therefore risks us our own security. So that's a that's a mindset that can justify a lot of things, you know. But what they really meant, if you go to the Kennedy era, is that even though the U.S. had this huge advantage at the time in nuclear arsenal compared to the Soviets, and the Chinese actually had nothing while Kennedy was president, they worried that if the Soviets didn't believe we would use them, then the weapons actually were fairly meaningless. In a certain sense, that's probably true. But I mean, what's the answer to that? It's just the way the world is. What are you going to do? Just use these weapons? And the problem is, if you take these type of thinking to their logical conclusion, you're going to get dangerous situations in crises, such as the Cuban Missile Crisis, the demands among the Joint Chiefs of Staff for Kennedy to bomb Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Proposals such as the Operation Northwoods reflects a desire to have a more aggressive posture, take advantage of opportunities when you can get them. And during the Cuban Missile Crisis, some members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff actually saw Kennedy's blockade or hesitation to make a decision, in their view, as provocative weakness. And they actually wrote memos to Robert McNamara lecturing him not to flinch if war turned out to be necessary, saying that they could even win. And here's one such memo. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but the ending sums it up. This is no time to run scared. So, you know, this is during the depths of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And a fascinating moment in the Cuban Missile Crisis, which I think provides light on all this. Because what I'm really trying to do is get into what are the motivations of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And you know, there's the famous confrontation is when Kennedy is meeting the Joint Chiefs of Staff in person. He gets into an argument of Curtis LeMay. Doug Horn mentioned that at the end of his talk. But the next day after that meeting, there is a very fascinating final meeting, not the end of the crisis, but a decision meeting, in which Kennedy and the members of the group talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis with him make the final decision on whether to do a blockade or whether to do an airstrike. They've been arguing about this, and now they have a final argument. And unfortunately, this is one meeting we don't have tapes of. And we don't have word-by-word transcripts of the meeting, but we have notes. And the most fascinating, I mean, they do decide to do the blockade, obviously, but one of the most fascinating parts of this whole discussion is this line from the notes, where General Taylor explains why they need to bomb Cuba. And he says, namely, if we do not destroy the missiles and the bombs, we will have to change our entire military way of dealing with external threats. What does that mean? Well, I mean, I'm not trying to say Taylor's crazy. I mean, I'm trying to say, I mean, at some point you do kind of have to laugh at these things because it is like dark stuff. You talk about Project Control or talk about nuking the Soviet Union, basically. And then here's a really strange line, but I think you can understand how someone could think or say something like this. Then I think we can understand how the national security state works, or at least how the Joint Chiefs of Staff works in the Pentagon, and what the real purpose is. Now, President Eisenhower's fear about what he called the military-industrial complex, in that famous speech, I got it on the cover of my book, his fear wasn't that the next president would be hemmed in by the national security state, so to speak, or or that we're going to have the Vietnam War or anything like that. What he primarily was scared of was our form of government actually changing completely, or our way of life. And in a series of a couple National Security Council meetings, his final ones, he expressed what this fear was, that the spending that the military was going to demand was going to overwhelm the government budget and just completely bust it. And he thought the result of that would be inflation that would get out of control. And I've always thought to myself, over the years, that, well, we have a giant budget deficit, and maybe everything's just going to go broke, and that'll be how our empire ends. We just go broke. And I think that seems sort of logical, but that's not what Eisenhower thought would happen. He thought what would happen was the inflation would get out of control, and it would never end. And we would basically mean the end of private enterprise as we know it, and everything would just be consumed by this. I mean, it's hard to imagine this kind of scenario. I mean, I can't really imagine it. And it obviously didn't happen. But then again, it did happen, because in 1972, the United States went off the gold standard. When we were on the gold standard, there was an actual limit to the size of the budgets we could make. And as I mentioned earlier, around 1967, the flow of gold started to go out of the United States into Europe because these deficits got bigger. And no one really knew what was going to happen. You can go back to the 1970s and find books predicting this would mean the complete collapse of Western civilization, basically, the end of the gold standard. And luckily Nixon took us off, and one result was there was inflation in the 1970s. Not as bad as Eisenhower feared, but it did happen. And then the situation seems to settle down eventually with Ronald Reagan and Paul Volcker, with lots of costs. Raising interest rates to stop inflation wiped out farmers across the whole country, put lots of people out of work. So there's victims to these economic policies that were necessary as a result of the whole mess of the Vietnam War financially, and basically the fears Eisenhower actually had coming to root in a way you don't really think of unless you read those notes and hear him talk about how he's worried about government spending. Now, I like to recommend one book to read about the subject of bureaucracy, because in the end, that's what the national security state is. It's a bureaucratic institution, and that's the best way, I think, to understand it. And a bureaucracy operates differently than a private enterprise does, and that sort of links back to the Nicholas Taleb saying that he had, that these people have no skin in the game. In a way, they have no financial loss at stake if they make a decision to, send people to war. But I think there's more to it than that, and it has to do with the way decisions inside of a bureaucracy are made, which isn't an easy thing to understand, even if you are in one. But I think that's how General Taylor can speak about, we've got to use these weapons or bomb, or else the weapons are no good, and then I have no purpose anymore. Basically, is what he's saying. What are we going to do? But the Mises book doesn't. It's a short book. It's pretty easy to read, and he's not saying all bureaucracies are bad. If I recall right, he likes the police force and the postal service. But if you just look at the postal service, or think of the Ponytail Express, that's a small bureaucracy. It's not that big, and they have a very simple, defined mission. That's just deliver the mail, and that's it, and go home at night, and take our paycheck. With the national security state, they don't have a simple mission. Their mission expands, it expands, and expands, with two purposes: to keep the United States safe, or us safe, but also to maintain order all over the world, which I think is their primary mission. But I wonder, to them, that makes perfect sense and is completely, in their mind, necessary. But I wonder if it really is. And a way a bureaucracy works, of the size of the Pentagon, most of the decisions are made at a lower level by people that are trying to do what they think their superiors want them to do, basically. Create proposals that they think will get passed or accepted, not make proposals that will be rejected, and they can take on, basically, in their own mind, the objectives of the organization. And any organization or bureaucracy, such as national security state, it comes into being with a purpose, a good purpose, at first. It came into being to win World War II, essentially. And I think it's, by the time we're bombed at Pearl Harbor, I think it's hard to argue against that. But any bureaucratic organization this big, over time, it'll come to have its own purposes that go beyond the original purpose. And that's one of the key insights of this book here, and also this book. Probably the best, I mean, if you forget about reading my book or the other Beast's book, but read this one. If you're going to read one book, Militarism USA, it's written by James Donovan, forward by David Shoup. David Shoup was a commander of the Marine Corps under John F. Kennedy. He was on the Joint Chiefs of Staff. James Donovan was one of his assistants. What this book does is essentially make all the arguments I just made today in a more eloquent manner and by someone who was there, at the highest levels. He won the Medal of Honor. You can't really argue with his life experience. Now, one thing he shows in that book, though, is he breaks down how the decisions on the Joint Chiefs of Staff are made. And they're made the way he depicts it on the planning staff, which Horn mentioned. But the planning staff consists of about 400 individuals from all branches of the service, mostly colonels, and their whole job is to come together and create war plans and to figure out how we're going to fight this war or that war. And one thing they have to do is incorporate every branch of the service into the plans, because they have to please everybody that they're working for. They're coming from their own organizations, and they got to divide up the budgets to make sure everyone's got a role, and so forth. So I'll go back to that project control as a case study of bureaucracy. So here's this fella, writes a dissertation. It goes up to the highest levels of the Air Force, and it's kooky. Basically nowadays we think of it as silly, and it was rejected by the White House and and Eisenhower's advisors. But why now did this go up? Well, I was reading about this in an Air Force history of this project, and after the French were defeated in South Vietnam, the Air Force had a problem, which I've read this for the first time. This is amazing. So when Eisenhower was president, he actually gave the Air Force more money than he did the other branches of service, and with a new look policy. But what it said was, you're going to use these weapons as a first strike. Not as a first strike, as a massive retaliation in case they do something to us. And that actually left the Air Force out of plans on what to do in the next war in Vietnam or elsewhere with atomic weapons or anything else. So how are we going to win a guerrilla war in South Vietnam or Laos or any of these other countries? What's the role of air power? And this guy's dissertation solved that. The next war will be not World War II and a half, not a guerrilla war. It'll be World War III, and they loved it because of that reason. So, at the time. So thanks for being here and being a part of this conference.
That didn't look good. That's Jenny, isn't it?
Oh, you're right. Good call, good call. Glad you said something. Because it would have been bad.
Yeah. I'm freaking out.
There you go.
Okay, here we go. Thank you. Peter Janney has been a practicing psychologist, educator, and consultant for over 35 years. He is the author of Mary's Mosaic, the CIA Conspiracy to Murder John F. Kennedy, Mary Pinchot Meyer, and Their Vision for World Peace. If you buy the book, which I highly recommend, it is a true-life murder mystery and page-turner. Once you start reading it, you will not be able to put it down. Be sure you buy the final edition, third edition, because it provides a real up-to-date recapitalization of what he's talking about in the book. It details his many years of investigation into Washington's most famous unsolved murder of Mary Meyer. The book was the general nonfiction winner of the 2012 Hollywood Book Festival and received honorable mentions in the 2012 Northeast Book Festival and the 2012 London Book Festival. Hollywood producer and director Oliver Stone, who directed the movie JFK, called the book a fascinating story and said that, quote, Peter Janney's unsparing analysis moves us closer to a reckoning. A graduate of Princeton, where he studied American history under Martin Duberman, Janney earned a doctoral degree in psychology at Boston University in 1981. He currently resides by the sea in Beverly, Massachusetts. The title of his talk is JFK and Mary Meyer, Relationship as Redemption. Peter Janney.
Okay, great. Well, very nice to be here. Very taken with what's taking place today and the things that have been said. This is going to be a little bit of a different talk. I'm not a journalist by trade. I'm not a historian by trade. I'm a clinical psychologist, but I bring a wealth of what I would call intensive research to how this story unfolded, because I was part of it indirectly. And as most of you who have read the book know, I pretty much come to the conclusion that my own father was part of the conspiracy to murder Mary Meyer in 1964. I want to just begin by just saying a couple of things about the study of history. Having spent a lot of time reading history books, I think I personally have come to the conclusion that, today we are still on the battlefield of memory in terms of what took place in Dallas in 1963. And that means that history is always going to be revisionist to one degree or another. The judgment of history is never set, because history is ultimately a moving dialogue. Even today, many historians are still fighting over, for instance, the American Revolution. Every piece of history, therefore, to one degree or another, ultimately is subjective, because it comes through the mind of a particular historian. And while historical accuracy and objectivity must always remain the historian's holy grail, it can only be approximated and never really consummated. Still, there is much good historians can achieve, particularly in exposing those facts that any society tends to hide about itself. facts about wealth and poverty, tyranny and lies, and then, of course, assassination and murder. The closest that we can come to exclusive objectivity is to report accurately all the subjectivities in any given situation. And that requires scrupulous honesty in reporting the past when we compare the government's self-proclaimed benevolence and devotion to democracy to its actual policies, thereby exposing the hidden ideological pretenses that pervade our culture. Therefore, in terms of telling our history, we have to tell it ourselves. It's an ongoing and never-ending struggle. Each generation has to wrestle with the history of what came before and then ask, whose interest does this history serve? How does it advance a legacy it serves? For instance, the power of the peace movement in the late 1960s changed the entire national security apparatus, including the CIA and the Pentagon. We have to resist their military occupation of our minds and the minds of future generations. Now, there are forces in our culture that stand for denial, and I don't mean just climate denial or the truth of indigenous people who have occupied this continent long before Euro-Americans arrived to conquer them, but generations of denial which have created historical denial. Our national forgetting and denial is basically pathological from a psychologist's point of view, because our systems, our politics, our media, our culture, they're totally out of balance. Our collective refusal to admit that the Vietnam War, for instance, was wrong and the anti-war peace movement was right is a very important example of that. Now, a really good example of what I'm talking about is if we look at what is taking place in Germany today and how they have integrated the Holocaust into the fabric of their nation's history. As filmmaker Michael Moore pointed out in his recent film, Where to Invade Next, every day in Germany, in every school, they teach their young what their predecessors did. They don't whitewash it. They don't pretend it didn't happen. They treat it as original sin, a permanent mark on their collective German soul, one for which they must always seek redemption, make reparation, and most importantly, never forget. And they can't forget, because outside of their homes, on the sidewalks, on the walls of the streets, are little engravings that remind them of the Jewish families that used to live in those houses and who were taken away and killed. Local artists have installed around town little signs that say Jews forbidden signs from the 1930s to continue to remind today's generation in Germany that to be German isn't just about Beethoven and Bach, but also about genocide and evil. What would our signs look like if we were to honestly look back at the assassinations that took place in the 1960s? What would our schools teach if we wanted to truly teach our young the whole story of what it means to be an American? The first step in any psychological healing to be a better person, and in a larger sense, a better country, is to stand up and honestly say who and what we are. I am an American. I live in a great country that was born in genocide and built on the back of slaves. That's just the truth. If there's one thing we should take from Germany, it is the idea that it is to acknowledge your dark side, come to terms with it, and face it honestly, thereby making amends for it. That way, you can free yourself of the past and evolve into something more whole and integrated, there becoming a better person, a better nation, and be a better fellow citizen for all of those on planet Earth. Now, in my exploration of the Cold War era, specifically with the understanding of how the CIA operated, given my father was in fact a high-level CIA official. No other Cold War historian other than L. Fletcher Prouty was the one who warned us that the greatest casualties of the Cold War had been the truth and the pursuit of truth. At no time in our history has the general public been so misled, so betrayed, and so deceived as it was in the last 20th century. So therein lies the cancerous tumor upon the soul of America. The CIA's inception, the entrance into the American landscape, fundamentally altered not only the functioning of our government, but our access to the real truth of what was actually really taking place. Simply put, the CIA's reign has contaminated historical truth. And while the dismantling of America's republic didn't begin in Dallas in 1963, that day surely marked an unprecedented acceleration of the erosion of our democratic republic. Now, the CIA was from its inception virtually unaccountable to any authority. It was subject to little, if any, congressional oversight, and that would increasingly haunt President Howard Truman and to some extent even President Eisenhower. Both were troubled by the fact that the agency had a carte blanche, get out of jail card free for anything it attempted. This was sort of came out of the 1948 NSC meeting 10-2, I think it's called. You'll forgive me, I get a little parched. But remember that the late elder American statesman George Kennan would publicly come out to deeply regret near the end of his life the power that had been given to the agency, part of which he signed off on. The get out of jail card free, known as plausible deniability, was, as Kennan told Yale historian John Lukács, the greatest mistake I ever made in my life. And in the mid-1970s, Kennan reiterated that statement before a U.S. Senate subcommittee. And of course, today it continues. Here is the statement of my friend John Kiriakou, who I think most of you know was recently, in the not too distant past, put in prison for a couple of years. This is what he says as late as this past March. One of the things that most observers don't understand is that the CIA will do anything to survive. All CIA officers are taught to lie. They lie all the time about everything to everybody. And they justify it by trying to convince themselves that they are doing it in the national interest, for national security. From my very first day in the CIA, it was drilled into me, as it is to every other employee, that, quote, the primary mission is to protect the agency. That was the mantra. Couple that with the CIA's ability to intercept today and take over virtually any communications device, and you have a Frankenstein monster. It's really hard to believe such an organization would resist a president who challenged it. That goes for JFK as well as Donald Trump. Is it hard to believe that it would do so surreptitiously? I don't think so, says Mr. Kiriakou. Now, let me turn to Mary Pinchot Meyer. Most of you who are familiar with my book or this story know that this was an exceptional human being, an incredibly beautiful woman who had a very significant influence, not on just JFK, but also initially her husband, Cord Meyer. She was born in New York City in 1920, the year women got the vote, in a family upon which there was quite a bit of wealth and privilege, and she was encouraged to explore and become independent. Her father, Amos Pinchot, was the leader of the progressive wing of the Republican Party, and he always worked toward industrial and labor reform. He would become one of the founders, along with Norman Thomas and Roger Baldwin, of the American Civil Liberties Union. Always outspoken, Amos was a champion of causes, no matter what it might have cost him politically or socially. Mary's mother, the journalist Ruth Pickering, was also born in New York City. She was 20 years younger than Amos when she married him. She attended Vassar College and Columbia University. She too came from a family of courageous liberal thinkers. She was the kind of rare woman who dared to define herself, even back in the 1920s, resisting the prescribed roles that most women found during that time playing. She became very active in the women's suffrage movement and for years shared a house with the political socialist Max Eastman and his sister Crystal. Now let's fast forward to February 1936. The young and beautiful Mary Pinchot is now 15 years old and already physically stunning and a beautiful young woman to behold. In her teen years, she had at her beck and call the debutante balls of New York City and New York City's nightlife. She hung out a lot at the Ritz-Carlton or the Waldorf Astoria. Mary always seemed to emerge as the belle of the ball. Her weekends were often filled with parties at New England's most elite prep schools, places like St. Paul's, Choate, and Groton among them. Now, while attending the winter festivities weekend in 1936 at Choate in Wallingford, Connecticut, her date for that weekend was the young and dashing William Atwood, whom she had been seriously dating since Christmas. Atwood, as we know, would eventually become President Kennedy's ambassador to the West African country of Guinea. He would also be at the heart of a Kennedy-sanctioned secret mission in the fall of 1963 to explore the rapprochement with Fidel Castro behind the backs of the Pentagon and the CIA. But in the winter of 1936, Atwood was the guy with the prettiest date at Choate. What Bill Atwood did not know that Saturday night in February of 1936 was that JFK, having already graduated from Choate, had decided to return for the winter festivities weekend and attend the gala Saturday evening dance. It was a black tie tails event, and we don't know, what drove JFK back to Choate at that time. That remains a mystery. I mean, when we look at this situation, how far could a tomcat like the young JFK navigate the confines of a heavily chaperoned New England prep school dance? And what would a college boy, he was still a freshman at Princeton then, no less want with a parochial school function anyway? But he returned unaccompanied. He was a stag. Perhaps he thought the homecoming was on familiar territory, would be good for his self-confidence, which had lagged since he'd been forced to take a medical leave of absence from his studies at Princeton. Whatever the force that drew him backward that evening, or forward, if we look at forces at work here, that's not known, but something propelled him. For during that winter festivities dance, he would encounter Mary Pinchot for the very first time, etching in his being an unforgettable moment. Gracious as she was, when JFK kept cutting in on the dance floor, with Atwood sporadically running upstairs to gargle Listerine because he had a very bad sore throat, still no romantic interest on Mary's part took place at that time. There were other men who would first cross her trajectory, Atwood being one, Peter Jessup being another, followed by Bob Schwartz, and then finally her husband, Cord Meyer. But the encounter between JFK and Mary in 1936 was, for the both of them, a major life event. When we look to history to help us understand events and circumstances that shape personal lives as well as the life and fate of an entire country, certain individuals seem to appear at the most extraordinary moments when the stakes could not be possibly higher. Now, in post-World War II America, with the new reality of what might it mean to live in the nuclear age. There were two young, very promising, very well-positioned men who were emerging as potential leaders of the new era. One of the fascinating elements of this era was that Mary Meyer would end up becoming the muse to both of them. Here we have the July 1947 issue of Glamour magazine. And in this magazine is a major feature article. It was called 10 Young Men Who Care. Here we just see young men who care, but they were ranked in order of importance. And the first two, which were tied for first place, were Cord Meyer on the left and John F. Kennedy on the right. Now, Cord Meyer was in many ways a wounded man, just as JFK was, both in his temperament. Cord was fundamentally a poet, and as one of his teachers liked to say, said, but when he exploded, he blew like a half gale. At his early years, Cord was decidedly a pacifist. His father feared the worst for his sensitive, artistic son as they prepared for World War II. And as all his sons, he had decided Cord would be able to take the pressures of war the least. Quote, if any of them crack up under it, he told one journalist, it will be Cord. So in the early 1944, on July 22nd, a Japanese grenade rolled into his foxhole, exploding in his face and killing his sergeant. Cord lay mortally wounded, contemplating death, bleeding everywhere, pieces of his teeth like half-eaten peanuts awash in his mouth in blood. With horror, Cord realized he was blind. Still conscious, he searched with one hand for his .45 caliber pistol to end his misery. Why had he not followed his conscience and refused military service, he bemoaned as he lay there dying, cursing nation-state savagery and war. As we know, Cord lived, and 2 years later, he would write an award-winning short story called Wave of Darkness, which he articulated that night in that foxhole. And this was his appeal for world peace as he emerged from the Second World War. And in this short story, there's a paragraph here that I want to read to you because it is fundamentally poignant to a level of who Cord Meyer was and why, like JFK, for a while at least, he really was a believer in world peace. And what he wrote was this, quote, what if he should get out of his foxhole and explain the matter reasonably to both sides? Fellow human beings, he would begin. There are very few of us here who in private would kill a man for any reason whatsoever. The fact that guns have been placed in our hands and some of us wear one uniform and some wear the other is no excuse for the mass murder we are about to commit. There are differences between us, I know, but none of them worth the death of one man. Most of us are not here by our own choice. We were taken from our peaceful lives and told to fight for reasons we cannot understand. Surely we have more in common than that which temporarily separates us. Fathers, go back to your children who are in need of you. Husbands, go back to your young wives who cry in the night and count the anxious days. Farmers, return to your fields where the grain rots and the house slides into ruin. The only certain fruit of this insanity will be the rotting bodies upon which the sun will impartially shine tomorrow. Let us throw down these guns that we hate. With the morning, we shall go together in charity and hope and build a new life and a new world. Following his convalescence, Cord began seeing a lot of Mary Meyer. They had known each other beforehand, but they had never really dated seriously. And I think for Cord, Mary became the Roman candle, who not only demanded and supported his vision of a world without war, but also shared an emerging focus on how to convince the masses of its rightness. And this was really what drew Mary and Cord together. Cord became very interested in the new UN, United Nations, and its charter meeting in 1945 in San Francisco, but he knew it wasn't going to go far enough, and that's when he got involved with something called the United World Federalists that really wanted to take the United Nations principle to a much higher level, where they could monitor throughout the globe hot spots that were taking place, intervene in an appropriate way, and diffuse the situation. Unfortunately, this effort failed, and in 1948, Cord was started to get seduced by Allen Dulles, but he didn't eventually join the CIA until the early 1930s, and it wasn't his first choice. Cord really wanted to be a writer, and he could have easily been an outstanding writer, but he did not have the courage, in my opinion, to take this dream and follow his own accord with it. As he wrote in his diary, "If I had more faith in my creative talent, I would write." But he didn't. And so in the early 1950s, he allowed himself to be seduced by Allen Dulles, like many people in his generation, and that's where the beginning of the end of that marriage and relationship took place. They finally divorced in 1957, and Cord, as we know, went on to deeper and darker pursuits within the agency, and it eventually, I think, really just killed his soul. It's very interesting that one of Mary Meyer's close friends, Anne Truitt, wrote in her book later on in the 1980s that there was a dynamic that she came upon with the men who came out of World War II. And she wrote something very perceptive, and I'm going to read it. This is it. Quote, "Confronted by the probability of their own deaths, it seems to me that many of the most percipient men of my generation killed off those parts of themselves that were most vulnerable to pain, and thus lost forever a delicacy of feeling upon which intimacy depends. To a less tragic extent, we women also had to harden ourselves and stood to lose with them the vulnerability that is one of the guardians of the human spirit." I think, one of the misfortunes of the Kennedy era is that, as we know now, JFK had a lot of difficulty with emotional intimacy. He had a lot of difficulty with women. From a psychologist's point of view, he would have what I would call a bona fide sexual addiction. But there was a clearing that was taking place. And I think Jack's relationship with Mary Meyer was, in fact, a relationship of redemption. And that's what I like to call it sometimes. Mary understood that JFK's conflicted hunger, as perhaps only a uniquely enlightened woman could, she viewed some of his sexual wanderlust for what it was, a symptom of his unresolved anger and hatred of the rejection that he had been forced to endure from an empty, cold, and distant mother. And it was clear in my research and people that I talked to that in their relationship together, Mary really laid down the law, so to speak. It was not a situation of anything goes. She demanded Jack's self-examination. She demanded that he open his eyes, his heart, his soul, the core of his being to both the artifice and the reality of his existence, including his sexual promiscuity. She would have refused to allow him to hide behind his physical incapacity, his sense of obligation to his father or the Kennedy family, his fear of public ridicule, or any indifference to such issues as civil rights and the dangers of the Cold War. She would have taken him to task in a way that some part of him actually longed for, knowing the emotional pain he would have to confront. In order to reclaim himself, Jack would have be willing to experience the grief and emotional tendency to experience what Mary herself had faced with the loss of her son Michael. You see, Mary knew the drill, the crashing surf of unbearable sorrow, and what was required to survive it. This was a woman who would have been once tender and firm with him, yet demanding that he show up, engage, and stop running. I think for Jack, Mary likely represented the hope of a lost love, a magnetic, romantic passion, the kind of erotic chemistry he had once experienced with the woman Inga Arvad, tempered by the same kind of no bullshit, heartfelt bond that he had shared with his departed sister Kathleen. Aware of Mary's multidimensional beauty and allure, from across the room at one of the White House dinner dances in February 1962, Jack had leaned in and commented to his friend Ben Bradley, quote, "Mary would be rough to live with." And according to Bradley, this wasn't the first time he had made this comment. And as Bradley noted, and I agreed, this was not the first time. There wasn't any doubt that JFK's remark revealed something about the nature of his relationship with Mary. There were undoubtedly moments when Mary was in fact rough to live with, but something in Jack had been awakened by Mary, an entrance into his life, something that kept him engaged and apparently wanting more. Such was the fire and hope, not only of love's redemption, but of a more clearly defined reclamation of himself and the kind of president he wanted to become. JFK's closest advisor, Kenny O'Donnell, had confided in the late author Leo D'Amour that Mary had been quite outspoken, for instance, and confrontational when the president was about to resume nuclear testing in April 1962. Quote, "She openly challenged him to do something different, not fall into the trap of getting in a pissing contest with the Russians," said Leo D'Amour to me in 1992, based on what O'Donnell had said to him. According to D'Amour, O'Donnell sometimes even feared Mary because of the power she had over Jack, telling D'Amour that the president would sometimes feverishly pace around the Oval Office when he wasn't able to get in touch with Mary. But vulnerability isn't necessarily the sign of weakness. Very often, it's the emerging strength of a healing heart crying out for connection. Mary had a serenity about her, reflected Ben Bradley in an interview with me in 2009. She was a serious person. If she fell in love with somebody, I suspect that person was really loved. When we look at what other people have written about Mary, go to Herb Parmet's groundbreaking 1983 biography of Jack, and he had interviewed a close confidential source. I think it probably was Kenny O'Donnell, but he said this about Mary, quote, "He could talk in ways with her she understood, and their trust was mutual. When he was with her, the rest of the world could go to hell. He could laugh with her at the absurdity of all the things he saw around his center of power." Most striking, toward the end of 1962, after the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis, inside the White House, Mary Meyer had become almost a part of the furniture. In the words of White House counsel Meyer Feldman, according to what he told author Nina Burley, quote, "Unlike some of the other women and men in the White House, the president did not ask her to leave the room when he discussed business," wrote Burley. So frequent was her proximity to the president and so obvious Kennedy's admiration for her that Feldman felt that he might make a good conduit to the president's ear if and when it was unavailable to discuss matters of state with him. In fact, Mary's emerging presence in the White House was more than just documented in the entry logs. Said Feldman again, "I'd walk out of the office all the time, and I would see her in the Oval Office or over at the residence. Around 8:30 in the evening, when the day was over, I'd walk over to the residence and she'd be sitting there. There wasn't any attempt to hide her the way there was with some of the other women." Just as fascinating was Mary's evolving position within the Kennedy White House itself. The senior staff never seemed, she was never regarded as second tier. Mention of her name even might be considered advantageous for employment, in the opinion of Arthur Schlesinger. Here's a memorandum that Schlesinger wrote to Kennedy at the end of 62 when they were discussing writing the history that they wanted written of the Bay of Pigs. And Schlesinger is saying, "Look, I know this historian Trimble Higgins, but Mary Meyer knows her much better than I do, and I'm sure you can get a clearer indication from her as to if he'd be suitable or not." As we've talked about today, the day, June 10th, 1963, was a major life event for JFK himself and probably for our country as well. What we don't know much about was the fact of what happened that evening after he gave that speech. The American University commencement address had become a watershed, defining a moment in which this visionary president decided to take the world in a profoundly different direction. It's breathtaking to behold the kind of courage and leadership that our 35th president began to embrace that day. And so I asked the question, had the muse of Mary Meyer finally found its true object of transformation? That evening of June 10th had also brought with it a small private celebration. Just before 8 p.m., at next to the last minute, with Jackie away at Camp David, JFK decided to stop by his friend Joe Alsop's house in Georgetown. Opting to come, quote, just for a drink, the president would stay for more than an hour as guests for Alsop's dinner party began to arrive. You can imagine who was also there. Mary Meyer was already there, and I'm almost as certain JFK knew she would be. If, as Joe Alsop described it, Jack was, quote, in a gay mood that early June evening, you can bet that Mary herself must have been ablaze, and not just because the flowers in bloom everywhere were coaxing her to smile. On that day, Jack had ventured to go where Cord Meyer would never have gone. Her mission had become illuminated into her mosaic, a subliminal peace song whose emerging, though still faint melody had just premiered for all mankind earlier that day. During cocktails in the Alsop garden, Mary sat with Jack on one side and Ambassador Bill Atwood, her prep school beau and college beau, on the other. Bill Atwood would recall 3 years later that on that evening, the three of them had turned to the enjoyable recollection of past events, quote, reminiscing about our old school days, with Mary as his date at Choate, and how Jack had, quote, happily recalled having cut in on them on the dance floor. Said Atwood, "It was hard at times like that to realize that he was president of the United States. And it was impossible to imagine that inside of a year, both of them would be murdered, he in Dallas and she in Georgetown." Okay, I've just been told I only have 5 minutes left. That's unfortunate. Time flies when you're having fun. What I wanted to say was the next part of my talk was, and this will be posted, was to talk about the focal points of the CIA that Allen Dulles arranged with Fletcher Prouty, and to underscore the fact that there was a copycat assassination attempt on JFK on November 2nd in Chicago. It was an exact replica of what happened in Dallas 3 weeks later, and it was suppressed. We never learned about what took place until the Assassination Records Review Board demanded that the Secret Service turn over the records, and at that very point, the Secret Service destroyed all the records so that we never knew from the Secret Service point of view of what actually happened. I also wanted to say that in my pursuit of this story, to get to where I have gotten, and there will not be another edition, I promise you, I had to jump through a lot of hoops and make a lot of sacrifices. And I never could have really gotten to the bottom of who Lieutenant William Mitchell was and what his role was in the assassination of Mary had I not had some help from a very special person who came into my life, who helped me since 2004 get to the bottom of how to look at this story and what was really going on. So when I won't spoil it by telling you the story. I think it's a genuinely interesting read, particularly the last 2 chapters of the 3rd edition. And that's where you will learn that there was a focal point office where William Mitchell worked in the Pentagon, and his boss, which was Lieutenant Ralph Heller Cruikshank, was part of the operation to take Mary out, as was Mitchell. I doubt if Mitchell knew of any of the other people on the team. He had one job, and that was to frame Ray Crump, which he attempted to do very professionally the next day, but he failed because what they didn't count on was W. Roundtree, the incredible African-American attorney who realized that Mr. Trump was being railroaded in this case. So finally, when we procured the documents that we procured, we were able to realize that Mitchell's oath of office took place on June 11th in 1962, the same day of his Cornell University graduation and his ROTC graduation at Cornell. He was absent. He was in Suitland. He had a used car salesman sign his oath of office because directly across the street in the Suitland Federal Building was a secret office of the CIA where we believe he was getting inducted, so to speak, in terms of what his actual role would be when he went into the Army. So that is his oath of office. There you can see that Mitchell is being sent to the Defense Intelligence Agency after swearing in a deposition that he had no connection with any kind of intelligence agency ever. And here is his locator card showing that he arrived at the Defense Intelligence Agency. So I want to just take, I've been told I have 1 minute now. I want to introduce you to the person who was just indispensable to me in figuring all of this out. His name is Roger Charles. He has had a near 30-year career as a journalist. He's investigated such diverse subjects as the detainee abuse at Abu Ghraib. He's a Peabody Award-winning journalist. He's the author of the definitive book on the Oklahoma City bombing, and he is a whiz kid when it comes to looking at documents, intelligent documents, military documents, and understanding what was really taking place. And what Roger says, you can read right there in terms at the very end of my book. He puts his stamp of approval on where this journey finally took to me. And as Roger says, he believes that it's pretty clear that Mr. Mitchell was in some way connected to the CIA. So, Roger, I wondered if you would just stand up and let people see you. And, yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, Jefferson Morley. Jefferson Morley is the moderator of JFKFacts.org, which I consider one of the best, if not the best, websites that cover news relating to John Kennedy and the Kennedy assassination. He worked as an editor and reporter at the Washington Post, The Nation, The New Republic, and Harper's Magazine. His work has appeared in the New York Review of Books, the New York Times Book Review, the Washington Post Book World, Reader's Digest, Rolling Stone, and Slate. His first book was Our Man in Mexico, Winston Scott and the Hidden History of the CIA. His book Snowstorm in August details what happened when the anti-slavery movement first came to Washington, D.C. during Andrew Johnson's presidency. Jeff is also the author of FFF's best-selling ebook, CIA and JFK, The Secret Assassination Files. His newest book, a biography of James Jesus Angleton, CIA chief of CIA counterintelligence from 1954 to 1975, will be published by St. Martin's Press later this year. The title of Jeff's talk is Angleton, Cuba, and Assassination. Jeff Morley.
Hi, thank you all. Thank you, Jacob, for that introduction and setting up this marvelous event at which I find myself learning something new with every speaker. I hope to reward, and thank you all for coming. I've met a lot of people who I only knew by email. It's always gratifying to meet people in person, not digitally. So thank you for your coming. I hope to reward your interest by telling you a story about James Angleton, the chief of counterintelligence of the Central Intelligence Agency during the Kennedy administration. This story speaks directly to some of the themes that we've already heard. This describes the actions of the CIA as Kennedy pursued the strategy of peace that Jeffrey Sachs talked about. It illuminates the reality of double government that Michael Glennon talked about. And it adds some new details about Operation Northwoods, which Doug Horn talked about. So I couldn't have given this presentation or learned this story without the help of several people, and I want to thank them. First of all, John Newman, who introduced me to the CIA's Oswald file more than 20 years ago. Malcolm Blunt, who came all the way from England to attend this conference, who explicated some of the puzzles that we find in that file. And Bill Simpich, who alerted me to one of the key stories in there. I want to emphasize before I start also that nothing that I say in this talk depends on a conspiratorial interpretation of the assassination of President Kennedy. I'm not going to try, whatever your opinion, I'm not going to try and dissuade you from it or convince you of something else. I don't really have a theory of the Kennedy assassination, at least not one that I talk about in public. If you buy me a drink later, maybe I'll share one. If you buy me 2 drinks, I'll share 2. But that's not what I came here to talk about. I didn't come to talk about theories. I came to talk about facts, and everything that I say in this presentation is empirical fact. The fact is, James Angleton was the embodiment of Cold War espionage and has become that in our popular culture. He's a world historic important figure that you may think you know something about, and so you should. And you should buy my forthcoming book, The Ghost, The Secret Life of CIA Spy Master James Jesus Angleton, which will be in bookstores in October. Angleton deserves his legend. He was an extraordinarily influential figure in the American government during the Cold War, a veritable founding father of the CIA. All of 30 years old when the CIA was founded in 1947, he spent the next 3 decades distinguishing himself, elevating himself into a position of transcendental influence on the U.S. government. He had a vast array of contacts from the Ivy League to the Vatican to organized crime to the Masons to the Mossad. He cultivated a deep knowledge of the Soviet intelligence services, the Cheka, the NKVD, and the KGB. And he knew how to ingratiate himself with men of power like Allen Dulles, J. Edgar Hoover, and Richard Nixon. As chief of the agency's counterintelligence staff from 1954 to 1974, he established a fiefdom of secret operations within the CIA, a CIA within the CIA, that virtually no one in the elected government of the United States knew about, and he ran it for 20 years. In Angleton's story, we find both a chilling Cold War drama and a pivotal moment in the evolution of the U.S. government and the emergence of the American national security state. The gist of my argument today will strike most people in this room as more commonsensical than original. That Kennedy's assassination was a decisive moment in the evolution of the American national security state. I only want to take this time to make that point with slightly more precision. It was the aftermath of JFK's assassination that was the pivotal moment, at least as far as the consolidation of the national security regime went. And Angleton was a key figure in that moment. The assassination in Dallas was a moment of great danger for the CIA. If the agency or any of its employees had been held responsible for the wrongful death of the president, its powers might have been curbed. The clandestine service might have been abolished, as former President Harry Truman urged 1 month after JFK's murder. If the CIA's role in the events leading up to Dallas had been shared with the Congress and the American people, the ambitions and the prerogatives of the national security state might have been checked. That did not happen, thanks in no small part to James Angleton. My story has 3 strands, and I'm going to summarize them before I explain them. The first is Angleton's mole hunt. This was his search for a KGB spy in the ranks of the CIA. And as he hunted for the mole, he monitored the movements of a defector to the Soviet Union named Lee Oswald. The second is Angleton's largely unknown role in JFK's Cuba policy. Angleton discussed the assassination of Fidel Castro as early as 1961, and he advised the Pentagon on regime change policies in 1963. The 2 strands intersected in the fall of 1963 when Oswald showed up in Mexico City at the Cuban consulate and the Russian embassy. Angleton's staff was immediately notified. And the third strand of the story grows out of the first 2. How and why Angleton hid what he knew about Oswald from the Warren Commission, the Congress, and the public, with consequences that we are still grappling with today. Now let us begin at the beginning. Jim Angleton and Jack Kennedy were born 6 months apart in 1917. As with JFK, 2017 is the centennial of Angleton's birth. Angleton and Kennedy both came from families, newly wealthy families, and they inherited the privileges of money, foreign travel, and an Ivy League education. They both embodied the aspirations and the fears of the American elite after World War II. And indeed, they knew each other. Angleton and his wife Cicely lived just off Glebe Road in North Arlington, and they were social friends with John and Jackie Kennedy, who lived in Georgetown. Like many others, the Angletons found the Kennedys enormously attractive. JFK's ironic charm reminded Cicely Angleton of a certain Shakespearean aristocrat. When Kennedy was elected president in November 1960, She wrote to a friend, "Prince Hamlet is in the White House." By the time of Kennedy's election, Angleton was already knowledgeable about Lee Harvey Oswald. His interest had been prompted by the arrest of one of the CIA's most valuable spies in the Soviet Union, a man named Peter Popov. Popov was a Soviet intelligence officer who had been feeding the agency a stream of information about the Red Army for years. In October 1959, October 19th or 20th, Popov was arrested. He was later tried and executed. In the offices of the CIA, then housed in a series of temporary buildings along the reflecting pool on the National Mall, the CIA men debated what had gone wrong. Bill Harvey, chief of CIA Berlin base, thought Popov had been exposed by the sloppy tradecraft of one of his Moscow handlers. So did Bill Hood, another senior officer who was involved in the handling of Popov. Angleton disagreed. He suspected Popov had been betrayed from within by what he called a mole, a spy within the ranks of the CIA itself. And Angleton's suspicions soon hardened into a fixed idea, which fueled his legendary mole hunt. It all began with Peter Popov's arrest, said CIA's in-house historian David Robarge. After that, Angleton became fixated on the mole. It was, not coincidentally, it was 2 weeks after Popov's arrest that the paper trail connecting Angleton to Oswald begins. One of Angleton's most trusted staff members was a woman named Jane Roman. She served as his liaison officer, handling all communications with other federal agencies. On November 2nd, 1959, in her daily call with Sam Papich, the FBI's liaison to the agency, Papich asked her about a story that had appeared on A7 of the Washington Post on the previous Saturday. Ex-Marine asked Soviet citizenship. The wire service reported that a 20-year-old former Marine from Texas named Lee Harvey Oswald had shown up at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow and announced his intention to become a Soviet citizen. When Roman received a cable about Oswald from the State Department the next day, she scrawled on top, "Mr. Papich would like to know about this ex-Marine who recently defected into the USSR." Oswald was an obvious target of the counterintelligence staff interest. It wasn't unheard of for an American to move to Moscow in 1959, but it was certainly unusual. Roman, seen here, routed the cable to her colleague Birch O'Neill, the chief of an office known as the Special Investigations Group. The SIG, as it was known, was responsible for keeping files on defectors. O'Neill supervised a staff of 8 people, including a woman named Betty Eggeter. She was the master of the office filing system. Eggeter described the Special Investigations Group as the office that spied on spies. The SIG was the operational arm of Angleton's mole hunt, and not coincidentally, the SIG controlled Oswald's file. The proof of Angleton's interest in Oswald can be seen in the CIA's unusual handling of his defection. Standard CIA procedure called for the opening of a personality file, known in the lingo of many federal agencies as a 201 file. The CIA's central file registry had tens of thousands of 201 files, some of them fat, some of them thin, some of them filled with classified information, some of them holding only a couple of newspaper clippings. Oswald, an ex-Marine with a security clearance who had threatened to share military secrets with the enemy, certainly qualified for a 201 file. Nonetheless, the Special Investigations Group chose not to open a 201 file on him. Instead, on December 9, 1959, the Office of Security opened a file on Oswald, labeled OS 351-164. This file then became the repository of all information received about Oswald. Needless to say, the Office of Security did not create Oswald's file without consulting Angleton's staff. The SIG served as, quote, a liaison office between the CI staff and the Office of Security, Betty Eggeter later explained. We worked very closely with the Office of Security. In the case of Oswald, the unusual procedure had to be approved at the highest level. Robert Bannerman, who served as deputy director of the Office of Security in 1959, told historian John Newman, Jim Angleton was in on this. Angleton's interest in Oswald was finely tuned. The effect of creating an OS file instead of a 201 file was to ensure that information about the ex-Marine was held more tightly. So, if someone inside the agency, like the KGB mole that Angleton thought was working in his midst, wanted to know more about the ex-Marine whose defection the Washington Post had reported, he would have to ask for the file in writing, provide a name, office, and phone number. If there was a 201 file, that paper trail would not have been created. By creating a restricted OS file and not a 201 file, Oswald could determine who in the ranks of the CIA was interested in him. The unusual handling of the Oswald file was one of Angleton's techniques for searching for the mole whom he thought had betrayed Peter Popoff. In October 1960, the State Department sent a notice to the CIA stating that it wanted up-to-date records on all recent defectors. That missive, according to the CIA's account, prodded the counterintelligence staff to act. In December 1960, a year after Oswald's defection, Betty Eggeter completed the paperwork to create a 201 file for Oswald. It now contained a dozen items, 4 memos from the State Department, 2 from CIA, 2 from FBI, 1 from the Office of Naval Intelligence, and 3 newspaper clippings. For the next 3 years, all reports on Oswald from anywhere in the federal government would be routed to the SIG and into the file controlled by Betty Eggeter. Now, let's turn to Cuba. After the election of John Kennedy in November 1960, Angleton became more involved in the agency's operations in Cuba, more involved than I knew before I wrote this book, and more involved than any scholars and journalists have known until now. Unlike his liberal friends, Angleton was immune to the notion that Fidel Castro was a nationalist or a social reformer with whom the United States could do business. After the humiliation of the Bay of Pigs in April 1961, Angleton was drawn more deeply into Cuba operations. On May 4th, 1961, the National Security Council tasked him with a new job to, quote, create, train, and support a highly motivated and professionally competent apolitical and career security service which will be dedicated to the preservation of the democratic form of government. Angleton, in short, was in charge of creating an intelligence service for post-Castro Cuba. To that end, Angleton discussed assassinating Castro. In November 1961, Angleton and Bill Harvey, now chief of the CIA's Cuba Task Force, met with Peter Wright, a scientist who worked for the British equivalent of the FBI, the MI5. In his memoir, Spycatcher, Wright said Harvey grilled him about how the CIA pursued assassination of its enemies. Angleton took such careful notes that Wright began to have qualms and second thoughts. Quote, the sight of Angleton's notebook was beginning to unnerve me. They seemed so determined, so convinced that this was the way to handle Castro, and I was slightly put out that I could not help more. Angleton questioned President Kennedy's Cuba policies, especially after the missile crisis of 1962. When the CIA's overflights confirmed the construction of missile silos in Cuba, Kennedy went public with the intelligence and demanded their removal. While the Joint Chiefs and most of Kennedy's civilian advisors, as we've heard before, recommended an immediate invasion, Kennedy played for time. Privately, he promised Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev that he would not invade the island, and the Soviet leader, fearing a wider war, ordered the dismantling of the missiles. On the brink of what might have been a nuclear holocaust, Kennedy had produced peace. His popularity surged. The Democrats did much better than expected in the 1962 midterm elections. But Kennedy also encountered a riptide of resentment from the military and intelligence agencies. Quote, the president emerged with his credibility and prestige measurably enhanced, wrote Pentagon historian Stephen Reardon in his official history of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. But to end the crisis, he made compromises and concessions that his military advisors considered in many ways unnecessary and excessive. The consensus on the Joint Chiefs of Staff was that the United States had come out the poorer end of the bargain. Angleton shared this view. Late in life, he wrote that Kennedy had fumbled away a chance to liberate Cuba. Quote, there was first Kennedy's unmistakable faltering of will at the Bay of Pigs, followed 18 months later by his reluctance to make good the showdown and exact fair price for the missile crisis by forcing Castro's expulsion from Cuba for having conspired with the Kremlin to bring Soviet nuclear power into the Western Hemisphere. For Jim Angleton, his wife's analogy of JFK to Hamlet was apt. Like the Danish prince, the American president was intelligent, self-absorbed, and indecisive. In Angleton's view, he lacked will, and the United States was weaker for it. In mid-1963, Angleton made his most important contribution to Cuba policy, a secret working paper entitled Cuban Control and Action Capabilities. This document was not provided by the CIA. It was found in the Pentagon records by the Assassination Records Review Board. It was declassified in 1997, as Doug Horn talked earlier. For Angleton and advocates of overthrowing Castro, this was a disheartening time, the spring of 1963. In March, Attorney General Bob Kennedy ordered the FBI to crack down on Cuban exiles who were using South Florida as a base for attacks on ships doing business with Cuba. The Cuban colony in Miami exploded in outrage. The Cuban Revolutionary Council, the CIA-funded umbrella organization that was supposed to constitute the new government in Havana, dissolved in acrimonious denunciation of the president. Many military and intelligence officials were concerned that the Soviet Union was solidifying its foothold in the Western Hemisphere while Kennedy was pursuing a nuclear test ban treaty with the Soviets that the Joint Chiefs thought was ill-advised. In a meeting on May 1st, 1963, the Joint Chiefs of Staff resurrected the secret plan for Cuba, known by the deceptively bucolic code name North Woods. The North Woods plans, as Doug explained earlier, were first developed after the Bay of Pigs fiasco. They sought to create a justification, a pretext for a U.S. invasion. The Pentagon planners on May 1st, 1963, recommended what they called, quote, an engineered provocation, saying that a violent incident that could be blamed on Castro would have advantages in, quote, control, timing, simplicity, and security. The chiefs passed on their recommendation to Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, who ignored it. He knew that President Kennedy and his brother were not interested, did not want to overthrow Castro by invasion. The Kennedys preferred the idea of autonomous operations against Castro, guerrilla attacks launched from outside the United States. With U.S. policy in flux, Angleton contributed an assessment of the Cuban target. What were Cuba's capabilities? What were its weaknesses? What would the U.S. military have to overcome in order to retake Cuba from the communists? Angleton studied the files, and he wrote up his findings in there were actually three documents, a 16-page working paper and two other attached documents. And on May 23rd, 1963, he distributed this document to the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the heads of 15 federal agencies. In this cover letter, Angleton stated that this was not merely a provisional statement on the Cuban situation, but was an all-source assessment of the communist control system. Angleton intended his paper to serve as nothing less as the foundation of a new national policy to eliminate the Castro regime in 1963 or 1964. The Cuban Capabilities Memo, in my view, is one of the most important documents bearing Angleton's name to ever surface. It confirms his leading role in Cuba policy in 1963 while demonstrating something of his intellectual power. Angleton's analysis of the strengths of the Castro government was lucid, detailed, historical, and comprehensive. Angleton asserted that Kennedy's no invasion pledge had demoralized Castro's foes. He said that the Cuban leader had emerged stronger from the October crisis, with up to 400,000 men and women now serving in the militias, the Army, and the Navy. Another bulwark of support for the regime, he noted, were friendship societies in the United States and other countries, which sent sympathizers to the island, who returned indoctrinated with pro-communist messages or perhaps with missions of sabotage, espionage, and assassination. In the course of his research, Angleton had reviewed multiple reports of travelers who had wished to conceal their visits to Cuba. And he wrote, an American citizen, for example, can enter Mexico with a tourist card, not even a passport, and obtain a separate visa to travel to Cuba from the Cuban consulate in Mexico City. He can go to Cuba and return supplied with a new tourist card obtained in Cuba without any indication that he has ever been there. This was remarkably prescient. That is exactly what the defector Lee Oswald would attempt to do 4 months later. Enter Mexico with a tourist card, go to the Cuban consulate in Mexico City, and seek a visa to travel to Cuba. Thus, Angleton's memo is also an important document in the record of the assassination of President Kennedy. The memo reveals Angleton's knowledge of and interest in Americans traveling to Cuba via Mexico and via the Cuban consulate in Mexico City in particular. It illuminates and confirms a fact that Angleton hid for the rest of his life. When Lee Harvey Oswald showed up at the Cuban consulate in Mexico City in September 1963, Angleton was not surprised, he was not uninformed, he was prepared. Let me pause here. This moment, 1963, Angleton was also witting to ongoing efforts of the CIA to assassinate Castro. This is one of the best stories, and I like this story because Angleton himself is the source of it. In June 1963, an FBI surveillance team at National Airport was following a mafia don named Johnny Rosselli, who the CIA had enlisted in the plots to kill Castro. Rosselli got off his plane, he got into a car, and the FBI agents were astonished to realize that the driver was none other than Bill Harvey, former chief of the CIA's Cuba task force, and now serving, allegedly, as the station chief in Rome. The FBI agents called Sam Papich, still the liaison to the agency, to complain. What was a top CIA official doing consorting with a mafia boss, who incidentally was suspected in no less than 13 murders? When the FBI agents called Papich, they discovered that he was at Angleton's house having dinner. Papich took the call, he put the phone down, he turned to Angleton, he said, "What should I do?" And Angleton said, "Let's go easy on this." The FBI surveillance team was called off, and people wondered, did Angleton know what Harvey and Rosselli were talking about at Duke Ziebert's restaurant? When Angleton was asked that question about Harvey, he said, "I knew he was not a frivolous man." Angleton's people had not forgotten about Lee Harvey Oswald in 1963. All U.S. government reporting on him still went into the SIG file controlled by Betty Egeter. And now that file contained a State Department cable on Oswald's marriage to a Russian woman in Minsk in 1961. There was a Navy memo about his plans to return to the United States with his wife in May 1962. There was an FBI interview with a surly and uncooperative Oswald outside his home in Fort Worth, Texas in August 1963. If Oswald was indeed a lone nut, as cliché would later have it, he was that rare isolated sociopath who was of intense interest to the CIA's counterintelligence staff. Needless to say, Angleton paid attention when J. Edgar Hoover sent him 3 more reports about Oswald in the fall of 1963. The first, an FBI memo from Dallas, arrived in Angleton's office on September 24th. Jane Roman signed for it. FBI agent James Hosty reported that Oswald drank to excess and beat his wife, and had once passed out leaflets for the pro-Castro Fair Play for Cuba Committee, one of those friendship societies that Angleton had identified in his Cuban capabilities memo. 2 weeks later, Jane Roman signed for another FBI report. Oswald had been arrested in New Orleans while passing out FPCC leaflets. The ex-Marine had gotten into a heated argument with 3 members of an anti-Castro organization, and he was arrested for disturbing the peace. So when a third report on Oswald came clattering in by teletype on Tuesday afternoon, October 8th, Angleton paid attention. From Mexico City, Station Chief Wynn Scott said a man calling himself Lee Oswald had contacted a consular officer at the Soviet embassy. Scott's cable, let's see if we can get that here. Scott's cable was slugged LC Improve, and you can see that at the top. LC Improve was the code name for, quote, counter-espionage involving Soviet intelligence services worldwide, Angleton's undisputed domain. Other cables, read by Angleton's successor, George Caleres, reported that Oswald had visited the Cuban consulate. In other words, this was a national security event. Defector to the Soviet Union, known to the counterintelligence staff for 4 years, and now active on behalf of a pro-Castro organization that had been targeted for destruction by the FBI and the CIA, had visited the Cuban consulate in Mexico City, which Angleton himself had cited as a locus of Cuba regime activities. Okay? Angleton had not forgotten about the Cuban consulate in the 4 months since he wrote his Cuban capabilities memo. When a character like Oswald showed up at the Cuban consulate, this was very important. And it was treated as such at CIA headquarters. Angleton's staff responded within 48 hours. On October 10th, Jane Roman drafted and sent a cable to other agencies in Washington, FBI, ONI, State Department, reporting that Oswald, wrongly described as 6 foot tall and 35 years old, had been overheard contacting the Russians in Mexico City. Then, later that afternoon, Roman and Betty Eggeter drafted a second cable. This one addressed to Win Scott in Mexico City. They showed a draft. This is the bottom of the cable indicates who signed on it. So Jane Roman had it in draft, and she wrote that, and then she showed it to Betty Eggeter, and then they took it to John Whitten, the chief of the Mexico desk, and he signed off as well. And then they took it to Angleton's friend Bill Hood, who was serving as chief of operations for the Western Hemisphere, and he signed off. And then they took it to Tom Karamessinas, the trusted assistant to Deputy Director Dick Helms, and he signed off. To be sure, Angleton's name does not appear on this cable. But the 5 subordinates who produced it did not act in defiance of his wishes or without his knowledge, not if they cared about their security clearance, their job security, their pensions, or their reputations. Curiously, the second cable said nothing about Oswald's recent arrest in New Orleans or his activities on behalf of the FPCC. With the latest FBI reports on Jane Roman's desk, Angleton's people could have described Oswald as a law-breaking communist and sometimes violent supporter of Fidel Castro. Instead, the cable to Scott was curiously reassuring. The agency had not received any new information on Oswald since his return from the Soviet Union a year and a half ago, according to the cable. And let's go back and look at that. Latest headquarters information was a State Department report dated May 1962. State had determined Oswald is still a U.S. citizen and his Soviet wife have exit permits and State Department approval for their travel with their infant child. If the October 10 cable was to be believed, and Win Scott believed it, the CIA had gathered no information on Oswald since his return from the Soviet Union 17 months before. That, to put it plainly, was a lie. The cable was deceptive, as Jane Roman would later admit when I interviewed at her house in Washington. When I showed her a copy of the cable, she said, "Yeah, I'm signing off on something that isn't true." I went to see Bill Hood, then living in retirement on Long Island, and asked him about the cable. Why didn't the CIA share the most recent FBI reporting on Oswald with Scott? Hood fell silent. After a brief silence, he said, "I don't think there's anything smelly in it," which I thought was a curious comment. And then he added, "I don't see a master hand in it." Well, if there was a master hand, it was Angleton's. The CIA's latest headquarters information on Oswald was not 17 months old. It was less than 2 weeks old. In the execution of a secret operation, Angleton's omission would have been justified. If Oswald's Cuba-related activities in 1963 were somehow part of an authorized covert operation, then Win Scott had no need to know about them. Which begs the question, was Angleton running Oswald as an agent for some intelligence purpose? He certainly had the knowledge and ability to do so. He was searching for a mole. He and his staff had a granular knowledge of Oswald's life, his movements, his family, and his political views. Angleton had a penchant for running operations outside of normal reporting channels. He articulated a vigilant anti-communism that depicted the results of JFK's liberal policies in apocalyptic terms. He participated in discussions of assassination, and he worked in a penumbra of cunning that his admirers did not fail to mention. Quote, Angleton possessed a unique grasp of secret operations, Dick Helms wrote in his memoir. Jim had the ability to raise an operational discussion not only to a higher level, but to another dimension. In 1963, 1964, and even into the 1970s, James Angleton could plausibly deny the existence of an operation involving Oswald. Those denials are much less plausible today. As to the nature and purpose of this operation, if there was one, we are only left to speculate. I can only say it most likely concerned what concerned Angleton, which was the mole hunt and the effort to change the regime in Cuba via an engineered provocation. In any case, the timestamp on the cable indicates Angleton's omission with precision. 10 October 1963, 5:29 p.m. Washington time. At that moment, President Kennedy was finishing up a busy day in the Oval Office. He'd spent the morning with his national security advisors, and he ended the day conferring with two leaders of newly independent African nations. He had 42 days to live. Within a week of Oswald's visit to Mexico City, and this is new, this is what Bill Simpich alerted me to, and I think it's important, Angleton launched a mole hunt in Mexico. This mole hunt underscores a reality that's largely been unknown to people who follow Angleton, that the mole hunt extended beyond the Soviet-Russia division. It reached into Mexico City, into the very offices that had been watching and reporting on Lee Oswald. In the fall of 1963, these declassified records unearthed by Simpich show that Angleton was worried about the CIA's Mexico operations may have been compromised by an FBI informant of the codename Layrob, who was actually, in Angleton's view, possibly a Soviet double agent. Angleton's friend, Bill Hood, chief of operations in the Western Hemisphere, then ordered an Office of Security team to interrogate the Mexican employees of the CIA offices in Mexico City and Monterrey. The first 3 employees who were questioned on October 8, 1963, were the 3 men who manned the surveillance points that watched the Soviet and Cuban diplomatic offices in Mexico City, the very offices that Oswald had visited the week before. Whether these men were asked about Oswald is unknown. The interrogators filed a report on each person who they questioned during the Mexico mole hunt, and the result was 21 reports on 21 different employees. And with each report came an attachment that described the contents of the interview, what they were actually questioned about. Of the 21 reports that are now found in the JFK records collection, the attachments are missing on 18 of them. The mole hunt in Mexico City was completed between October 8th and October 18th. The results were analyzed in Washington, and the results were sent to Bill Hood and to Angleton in early November. The Office of Security found some security breaches, some loose talk among family members, but no type of compromise like that was feared by Angleton. As far as the Office of Security was concerned, there was no mole in Mexico City. All the while, Lee Oswald remained a figure of interest. On November 15th, Jane Roman signed for the latest FBI report on Oswald. From New Orleans, senior agent Warren DuBrois had filed a more detailed memo on Oswald's pro-Castro activities. If Angleton scanned the first page, he learned that Oswald had gone back to Texas after his trip to Mexico City. Angleton knew that Oswald was in Mexico City, and he knew now that he was back in Fort Worth. Angleton always sought to give the impression that he knew very little about Lee Oswald before November 22nd, 1963. For the chief of the agency's counterintelligence staff, that was a frail defense. His staff had monitored Oswald's movements for 4 years. as the former Marine moved from Moscow to Minsk to Fort Worth to New Orleans to Mexico City and then to Dallas, the Special Investigations Group received reports on him every step of the way. By the time President Kennedy was preparing for a trip to Dallas, Angleton knew Oswald was in Texas. You can interpret that however you want. The plain fact is that an epic counterintelligence failure culminated on Angleton's watch. There's no evidence that Angleton knew the president's life was in danger before November 22nd. There's overwhelming evidence that Angleton had much to hide when Oswald was arrested for gunning down Jack Kennedy in broad daylight. And there's no doubt that Angleton succeeded in hiding most of that evidence. Let's talk about the cover-up. After Kennedy's assassination that day, Deputy Director Dick Helms put John Whitten, chief of the Mexico desk, in charge of collating all reports on Oswald, everything that had been learned. Angleton did not offer any evidence or theories of KGB involvement. He didn't argue that Castro was behind Oswald. He just tried to thwart John Whitten. Quote, in the early stages, Mr. Angleton was not able to influence the course of the investigation, Whitten testified in secret session years later. He was extremely embittered that I was entrusted with the investigation and he wasn't. In a meeting with Whitten and Helms on Christmas Eve 1963, Angleton attacked the latest draft on Whitten's report on Oswald as erroneous and unacceptable. Helms relieved Whitten on the spot and put Angleton in charge of the Oswald investigation. Quote, Helms wanted somebody to conduct the investigation who was in bed with the FBI, Whitten snorted. I was not, and Angleton was. Angleton's power had reached a peculiar apex. The ambush in Dallas marked the worst intelligence failure of the United States since December 7th, 1941, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and it happened on Angleton's watch. Yet such was his bureaucratic stealth that he managed to wind up in charge of the agency's investigation of the accused assassin. Before JFK's death, Angleton's staff knew more about Lee Oswald than just about anyone in the U.S. government. After the president was dead, Angleton orchestrated the cover-up of what the CIA knew. One advantage Angleton had was that the Warren Commission trusted the CIA. In February 1964, the commission staff learned that the CIA had provided the Secret Service with several cables on the night of the assassination, including the October 10 cable that I referred to before. The commission asked the agency to produce the material. Angleton resorted to deflection, but he needed Helms' support to rebuff the investigators. Jim does not desire to respond directly, Angleton's deputy Ray Rocca told Helms in a memo. Unless you feel otherwise, Jim would prefer to wait out the commission rather than turn over the CIA's records in their original form. Jim would prefer to wait out the commission. Why on earth would a senior CIA official wait out the investigators of a presidential assassination? Rocca claimed that there was nothing of interest in the cables. But of course, in intelligence work, the source of the information matters as much as its content. The cables included photographs of people coming and going from the Cuban embassy and a passenger manifest of people flying from Mexico City to Havana. And what these documents showed was that the CIA had the ability and the desire to photograph and identify every visitor to the Cuban consulate in Mexico City, to identify every potential American traveler to Cuba. And the October 10 cable proved that Oswald was no exception. Angleton preferred to wait out the Warren Commission rather than explain the CIA's knowledge of and interest in Oswald, and particularly his visit to the Cuban consulate, probably because that visit involved some kind of covert operation. If they come back on the if they came back on the point, Rocca told Helms, Angleton feels that you or someone should be prepared to go over to the commission with the materials and pass them on, rather than pass them on in copy. Howard Willens, an attorney for the commission, did come back on the point. He asked to see the original document. He was shown summaries instead, and he came away satisfied. I consider the CIA representatives to be among the more competent people in government who I have ever dealt with, he wrote in his diary after meeting with Rocca. They articulate. They are specialists. They do not have special access to grind in the commission's investigation. Willens never imagined the CIA was deceiving him on the fundamental facts of the events leading to the death of the president. In the fullness of time, Willens realized he had been duped. My journal comments about the CIA were naive, to say the least, Willens told me. The CIA did have access to grind. In particular, Willens said the agency's failure to disclose the plots to kill Castro compromised the Warren Commission. Angleton participated in that cover-up, too. On May 8, 1964, Angleton received a memo from Hal Swenson, chief of counterintelligence for the Cuba operations. Swenson had learned from a reliable source in the Cuban armed forces that Castro had probably known about the CIA's recruitment of Rolando Cubella as an assassin in 1963. Cubella, the Amlash operation, which was the code name for the Cubella operation, might have been an insecure operation prior to the assassination of President Kennedy. Thus, we know Angleton was witting to another plot to kill Castro, by May 1964 at least. The implications were obvious. If Castro knew about the Amlash plot, then he had a motive for killing Kennedy. Angleton chose not to investigate this apparent breach of security. He did not turn Swenson's memo over to the Warren Commission. Indeed, he seems to have destroyed it, which in any other homicide investigation would have been tantamount to obstruction of justice. When Angleton was called to testify about these events later, he lied. When asked if Oswald had ever been interrogated when he returned from Russia, Angleton fumbled for words. I just don't know whether the military would normally fall within the jurisdiction of the military, since he was a military man who defected. Angleton babbled, so I don't know the answer to that. In fact, Angleton did know the answer. The FBI interview with Oswald in the summer of 1962 had been sent to his office. Betty Eggeter signed for it. When the attorneys for the House Select Committee on Assassination pressed him about his knowledge of the Castro assassination plots, Angleton hedged. The question I want to ask you, the attorney asked, is, do you recall approximately when you learned the information about the Castro assassination plots? Was it before or after the Warren Commission? I am certain, Angleton said, that it was well after the Warren Commission compiled its work. That was perjury. Angleton's willingness to violate the law is hard to defend, but it's not hard to understand. A serious counter-espionage investigation of Lee Oswald would have uncovered Angleton's abiding interest in him. It would have uncovered the various operations to kill Castro. It would have revealed the damning fact that no matter who fired the fatal shot in Dallas, Angleton had failed disastrously as counterintelligence chief. To hide this sorry reality, Helms and Angleton fed the Warren Commission the cover story that they knew very little about Oswald before the assassination, that the CIA didn't even know that he had visited the Cuban consulate until after JFK was dead. That was a small but very telling lie. The fact that Angleton knew that Oswald had visited the Cuban consulate was proof that Oswald was a figure of intense interest in the fall of 1963. It had to be denied, suppressed, and erased from the record to sustain the cover story of a lone nut. Angleton could have and probably should have lost his job after November 22nd. Had the public, the Congress, and the Warren Commission known of his pre-assassination interest in Oswald and his post-assassination cover-up, he surely would have. Instead, his malfeasance, abetted by Dick Helms, went undetected. Angleton would remain in a position of supreme power for another decade. And so Jim Angleton came to embody the untouchable power of the American national security state after November 1963. Thank you.
Is Ron using one?
No.
Where is he? There he is.
Yeah, I see people taking a little stretch, so go ahead, about a couple minutes. Yep. Yep. Just take a couple of minutes. We're going to start up again in 2 minutes. Okay, we're ready to get started again. If you please take your seats. Okay. All right, we're ready with our next speaker. Ron Paul. Ron Paul was a Republican presidential candidate in 2008 and 2012, and the Libertarian Party presidential candidate in 1988. He served in the U.S. House of Representatives from 1976 to 1977, from 79 to 85, and from 97 to 2013. One of the country's most ardent defenders of freedom, peace, free markets, and sound money, Paul has long been a fierce critic of the Federal Reserve System, the IRS, the war on drugs, socialism, empire, interventionism, and the national security establishment. He has also been an ardent defender of civil liberties and a vocal critic of the USA Patriot Act, torture, indefinite detention, and NSA surveillance programs. A graduate of Gettysburg College and Duke University School of Medicine, Paul was a practicing obstetrician and gynecologist from the 60s through the 80s. The founder of the Ron Paul Institute, Paul is the author of several books on Austrian economics and classical liberalism, among which are The Case for Gold, A Foreign Policy of Freedom, In the Fed, Pillars of Prosperity, The Revolution, A Manifesto, Swords into Plowshares, and Define Liberty. And I might add, he is an absolute personal hero of, I think, every libertarian in the libertarian movement, especially me. The title of Ron's talk is Enemies, Foreign and Domestic. Please welcome Ron Paul.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Bumper, and thank you for inviting me. You know, when I was back in Washington, I would give occasional speeches. I'd take time on a special order. You could get time, 5 minutes, sometimes even up to an hour. And the one thing that happened with those speeches, I did my very best, but I never had any applause. So, so I'm glad to come here, and I get a little applause once in a while. So I need to boost my ego. But Bumper, it's great that you put this together. This is fantastic. And this organization, the Future of Freedoms Foundation, is a great organization. If you support it, and you should, because Bumper, it's really good. The only thing is, I have a little bit of question about him. He has all these fantastic speakers and intellectuals, and then he went and invited a politician to come. So I don't know about that. But I want to tell you, though, Bumper, you did have a little competition for me to get here. I had this other invitation. It was really a tough choice. There was a meeting held, matter of fact, in the area. It was over in Chantilly. I don't know if you know what's going on over in Chantilly, but I was tempted to do that. But then again, I got to thinking it would be much better to be among friends and feel safe and secure, because at that other place I might not have felt so safe. But no, it is great to be here, and of course the title of my talk is defending and support the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Of course, many people take that oath, and sometimes I get a little bit confused on that, because when I went to Washington, I thought I had a pretty good understanding about the Constitution. But then, we would go back and forth. And it turned out that my understanding was completely wrong, and they tried to convert me. But I had a little trouble listening to their arguments. They told me something about the Constitution should be more flexible, and it should be a living document. It shouldn't be overly rigid, and that's how you get into trouble. So I sort of struggled with that tremendously, and then I got to thinking, one compliment that I get, that I don't mind getting this, because I think sometimes the compliments are embellished a little bit more than it need to be. But the one is that, how did you go there? How did you put up with that nonsense and not have to join the gang? Because I was there for close to 24 years, and of course the one thing is my goals were different. My goal wasn't to be the chairman of the committee, because to do that, you have to sell your soul, you have to raise money, a few minor little things like that. So in my case, I do believe that when people say about me not joining the gang, it's true. Matter of fact, the longer I was there, the more I became very skeptical of government per se, and I became more rigidly determined that the problem's not with the people as much as it is with the government, and the government is just way too big, too intrusive, and you have all this nonsense going on. And that is the reason I believe that it's important that we stick to our principles and not say, well, a little bit of government here, a little bit of the government there. So for that reason, I left Congress much more adamant being opposed to big government than the motivation I had to go to Congress. But, I think the whole issue, we talk about all that's going on today and in foreign policy, and the bickering that goes on. There's a lot of that. But the bickering that we hear, from my viewpoint, has nothing to do with the important issue, and that has to do with philosophy. I don't believe there's, two parties. I believe there's only one party there, and I think bipartisanship is very bad. I think coalitions are okay, but bipartisan, everything gets done by bipartisanship. The two parties have to agree with everything that's been done for the 50 years. They agree on funding and not even examining these security budgets and the CIA. They don't. It's always bipartisan. Going to war. Just let them go to war and we'll finance them. So it's always a bipartisanship. But I frequently would get the criticism that I'm overly rigid. And it depends on what you're rigid about, depends on whether it's good or not. But I remember one time there was one of the members of Congress said, he was working to get a credentials that he was against corporate welfare. So the Export-Import Bank appropriation was coming up. So he wanted to cut it 5%, which meant nothing. And we had to vote, and it didn't pass. No way would dare, cut the Export-Import Bank. So the next vote I wanted to abolish the Export-Import Bank. So I supported the other gentleman's, amendment to cut it a little bit, but he wouldn't support mine. So I went up to him. I say, hey, look, I thought you were against this stuff. Why aren't you voting with this? He says, Ron, your trouble is you always just go too far. But I think this is one of the problems, whether it's foreign policy or domestic policy. If you concede the principle, I think you concede 100% of it. So if you say that we have to do such and such type of welfare program, or a little bit of war, a little bit of intervention, you concede this whole principle that we're supposed to do it. So I do think, although it's a goal that won't be easily achieved, you should take this principle, and much has been said today about non-interventionism. And I love that term, because non-interventionism tells you what liberty is all about. And it would go a long way for foreign policy as well. That we should be, if we believe in the cause of liberty, we should be non-interventionists. We should have a government that does not intervene in peaceful activity of all citizens. Just let us mind our own business. And, of course, we should have a government that, if you believe in markets, you should have a non-interventionist government that doesn't try to regulate the economy. And just think of the thousands and thousands of pages of regulations that go on. So it's too much intervention. And, of course, in foreign policy, it's way overblown, way too much intervention. But, there was a time when it really bothered me when you started reading, revisionist history, because it challenged me, quite frankly, when I started reading a little bit about the lead up to World War II, and that there was supposedly knowledge, possibly, of what was going to happen at Pearl Harbor. I just didn't want to believe that about my government. And so it took a long time to sort of soften my stand on that. But the same way, I was drafted in 1962 during the Cuban crisis, which was discussed here today. And then I was actually inducted into the service in the early 1961. I was the flight surgeon at the airport in San Antonio the day before Kennedy was killed, and I was in charge of the medical provision there. But there was no way at that time, when the assassination occurred, that I would say, our government may well have been involved. I wouldn't want to hear any part of that. And of course, things like the shooting up of the Liberty is one thing, and what about 9/11 Commission? But I've come to a conclusion. I'll just see if you think this is a pretty good assessment. I think commissions are great. Have commissions, study all this, because when they're done, they really help you out if you're looking for truth. Look at what they've said and decide exactly the opposite is the truth. We would have frequent briefings after 9/11. We had plenty, and there were briefings all the time to tell us what's really going on. Well, I think I attended one, and it was disgusting because I thought it was all just propaganda. It was spin. It was trying to get you to endorse a policy. So I had a rule. I just didn't go. For two reasons: that you weren't going to hear the truth, and the second reason is you could read it in the Washington Post the next day if you wanted, because they'll put the information out. But no, the propaganda in Washington usually was just a distortion of what was going on, especially in foreign policy. But this whole idea of defending and supporting the Constitution, pretty important. So how many people have said this oath, in our government, and yet there's not a whole lot of support in defense of the Constitution. But I can simplify this, because the oath that is taken says against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Well, I've concluded that if you want to do that you really only have about 50% of that responsibility, because it's hard for me to figure out who's going to invade us and destroy our Constitution. That all comes from internally, and that's where the enemies are here. They're destroying our Constitution. Just look at the loss of liberty since 9/11. It's incessant, and we do it to ourselves. So that's, to me, there are a lot of enemies that are internal, and that should be our job as much as anything. But overall, how do we get to this point where we're so out of whack of what the intent was with our Constitution? And I think one of the most important issues that deals with it is the educational system. I think if you look at the last 50, 60, 70 years, matter of fact, it even started under Eisenhower, especially with the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, and then the Department of Education, and now we have this totally bizarre, evil monstrosity of cultural Marxism, which is pushed by our universities. I mean, what kind of a university system do we have today where you can send a kid off, gets a fancy degree, and studies something in social studies? He ends up with a degree and $70,000 worth of debt, and he can't get a job, and he's supposed to be educated. It's a real mess. And the longer the federal government especially has been involved, the worse the educational system has become. I think it's an indoctrination system. I think it starts in kindergarten, and it's very simple. And this is why I like the simple answers to the problems. There is no authority in the Constitution for the federal government to be involved in education, and it should be taken out. They get rid of the Department of Education, and maybe something much better could replace it. Because of the system and what goes on, this is a great influence. The people I knew in Congress, many of them I considered very decent, but very confused. And they didn't understand economics, at all. And they reflect, what they've been told and what they've been studied. How many universities still today teach interventionist economics, Keynesianism, and whose most popular book in all the universities? Paul Samuelson. It had nothing to do with sound money and free markets and this sort of thing. So and that's why the majority of the people that come to Washington are going to do what they do, and they feel good about it. And once they accept this notion that there's something wrong with an overly rigid Constitution, and they have this excuse that you should be ready to adapt the Constitution, and then they get indoctrinated in our educational system, then we end up with this mess that we have. And yes, the details are important, and I spent a lot of time leading up to the Iraq War dealing with trying to point out all the reasons we shouldn't do it. I think one time I had one talk, I listed 34 reasons why we shouldn't do it, and that's important to do that. But overall, it's really the principle of the thing. Should we be involved? And the founders sort of gave us a hint. Stay out of entangling alliances. We don't need this internationalism. We need more emphasis on personal liberty, personal responsibility, and not internationalism. If education, there was no prohibition about the states or local communities being involved with education. I went through public school, and it was only the local community. And then the communities got bigger. Then the state took over. And then it was the federal government took over. And now it's the United Nations and everybody else that wants to get in on the act. And that is what's wrong. So I think that if you take a firm principle and say they shouldn't be involved, then things would be much better. Now, if you look at all our foreign policy, you say, well, how do they do this? Where do they get all the money? Well, they had to have a neat little system to finance this. This and welfare, the welfare warfare state, is very, very real, and it's deadly. And of course, if you go back to a few years prior to World War I, if you go back to 1913, they were already setting the stage. They were setting the stage in 1 year. They said that your income is not your income. It all belongs to the government, and we'll allow you to keep it if you do what we tell you. And if you don't do what we tell you, you will have to prove you're going to be considered guilty until you prove yourself innocent. So we started off small, and we had the income tax, and of course, along with that we had the viciousness of another instrument that I think that we should be concerned about, and that is another enemy of liberty, and that is central banking. You cannot solve these problems unless you deal with the monetary issue, and the best way to deal with that is the same way you deal with the Department of Education. You need to get rid of the Federal Reserve System. And of course, all the agencies and the internal revenue, the whole works. We just don't need that. But the conditions that really excite people, though, will be we have to be an international leader. We have to be the leader of the community. We have to be a world leader. Americans like it. Everybody likes it. I like the idea. I think we should be a world leader. But their idea, the opposition, their idea of a world leader is we own it, that we have an empire, and we support it, and you do it with a gun. I have another idea about supporting world leadership, is why couldn't we have a country based on personal liberty, non-intervention in our lives, non-intervention in the economy, non-intervention in other people's affairs, have sound money and free markets and set a standard and be the real leader of the world, not because we're telling them what to do, but because maybe they would like to emulate what we're doing because of our success. That is my idea of being a world leader. The chances of that happening, of course, aren't all that good right now. But like so many things, there's a good part and a bad part. And right now, it's real easy to talk about all the bad things because this last 100 years has not been kind to liberty. And although there's great prosperity, because if you own stock, you should feel real good. But for some reason, owning stocks right now, from my viewpoint, is superficial, and it doesn't reveal what's really going on in this country. And if you look and see what's happening in this country and who's doing it and who is the enemy, you have some sorting out to do. Right now, I am convinced at least half of our population, are in trouble financially. And even the economic statistics this week, revealed this. They have 95 million people that are out of the workforce. So what does that do? They're out of the workforce, so there are less people considered to be workers, and the unemployment rate's down to 4.3. So does that make everybody feel good? Well, Wall Street feels good. So it's gimmickry. And of course, when they ran into trouble in 08 and 09, what did they have? They have a real financial crisis. Well, let's go to the Congress and see what they can do because it's their responsibility. Well, they'd spend $1 billion here, $1 trillion here and $1 trillion there, saying they're going to solve that problem. But it was all fluff. It didn't do any good. We know that. Debt actually doubled since that time. It went from $10 to $20 trillion. But while the Congress is tinkering around with $1 trillion here and there, the Fed is tinkering with 15 or 17 trillion dollars and passing it out to make the economy great. There's a 500% increase in the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve, and quite frankly, it's not going to last, and it will just distort things. It will. The enemy, the philosophic enemies will have created this condition where there is a maldistribution of wealth. And so when the liberals complain about that, they're right. That why is this group over here more billionaires than ever before? Now we're going to have a trillionaire, and yet 50% of the people really are underemployed. And it's a consequence, though, of the government. It's a consequence of the Federal Reserve. It's a consequence of what happens when you destroy a currency. But right now, we're able to do this, through the Federal Reserve System. The people, they accept this whole notion that it's all right to pretend that what you need is inflation of money supply and money is wealth, and that'll solve the problem, which obviously isn't true. The report this past week tells us a little bit about what's really going on. New York City has a tremendous number of people who are homeless. The story yesterday was on L.A. L.A. had a tremendous increase in people, living on the street. And they went and somebody did an interview, and they talked to some of the people who were homeless. And it wasn't like they weren't working. Some of them were working and trying to pay the bills. And they were saying, my cost of living is too high, and I can't do this, and I can't afford the rent. And because it's too high, cost of living going up, rent's going up, I work and it's not enough. And what does our Federal Reserve say? Well, we do have a problem here, and we want to energize the economy. And how we energize the economy is we need to take the price inflation rate up to 2%. And we need more inflation and cause prices to go up, and rising prices to them is a sign that there's prosperity. It didn't help Zimbabwe, and it didn't help Venezuela. Prices soar. But this is the ridiculousness of the system that we have. But right now there's a bit of euphoria, and people are feeling great. And we have been able to capture this by being in a position of printing and creating the reserve currency of the world. And that, of course, really came out, and some speakers alluded to the strength of the United States after World War II. And it has been very strong and very trusting. We have the military, we have the wealth, and they trust us to a degree, but less all the time. But we've been able to do this, and deficits can be handled to the point, but it's all an illusion. And I think it all goes back to this idea that we as Americans should really question who the enemies are. What are the odds right now of some country coming in here and invading and taking over? Maybe after the chaos, who knows what's going to happen. But even, today we're in the Persian Gulf. I guess you realize we're over there. We have a few vessels over there, and planes and bombs and drones. And we have, we're very much involved in making sure that nobody drags up a lot of sand and makes a new island in the South China Sea. What would we do? What would the Texans do if they did that in the Gulf of Mexico? What if they did it in the Chesapeake Bay? And nobody wants to, in our country, they generally don't want to look and put the same calculation on ourselves as on others. And they too readily accept this idea that we are an exceptional nation, and that we have goodness to spread, and all you have to do is look and where all that goodness is and ask whether or not the military-industrial complex is enjoying this goodness, because they're part of the real problem. And so this is sort of inherent in the system. And until we look at this from an intellectual viewpoint and decide, what should our country be all about? Should we be defending and protecting liberty, or should we pretend that we know how to run people's lives? And they say, what are you going to do? Let the people die in the streets? They won't have any medical care? And we know that's all a fraud. The more people are suffering from lack of medical care now since the government's been involved. It's a disaster what's happening, and there's no way they can afford it. Once again, how could we solve that problem? Get the government out of believing, and the American people believing, that it's the federal government's responsibility to distribute medical care. They shouldn't be doing it. They don't have a right to do it. The one thing that has motivated many to support our foreign policy is this whole idea that there's a danger of terrorism. Well, there is a danger of terrorism, but if you've seen the statistics, comparatively speaking, they're rather minor. I think you have 100 times greater chance of getting hit by lightning than by a terrorist. And if you looked at city crime and inner city crime and the results of the drug war and how many people die, and I think it's something like 88 in a day, and yet you're talking a dozen or two or three from terrorism. But you got to build the fear of an economic collapse, and that's why the Fed has to do this and why Congress has to spend more money. The same way on the militarism. They're dangerous. They're coming. They're going to get us, and we have to go and stop them over there. And, the other biggest hoax on this foreign policy and this intrigue about defending the Constitution, a lot of people, how often you hear on TV now on why we have to be over there and why we had to go into Iraq. The justification was to go into Iraq to defend our Constitution and defend our freedoms. How ridiculous can it get? To go in, you're defying the Constitution. It was an undeclared war, and we've made ourselves so much less free. And people buy into this stuff. But fortunately, we still have vehicles. We have the Future of Freedom Foundation and a few others that's going to get this message out, because it can be changed. And that's where I tend to be a lot more optimistic than you might believe, because the chances are going to be numerous. Because the one thing for certain is that the system that we have, endless spending, endless debt, endless inflation of the money supply, endless intervention, it's going to end. It's going to end. And the big problem, though, that we have to face is, how is it going to end? Is it going to be so chaotic that there be decades of real chaos where we can't survive and make it difficult? Or will it be an opportunity? And I think it will be an opportunity, because I think today we have more groups giving out information like the Future of Freedom Foundation and others. And there's a lot of young people studying Austrian economics. There's a lot of people who do care and understand what civil liberty is all about. Even though the campuses are a mess, I still go to the campuses, still can get some people out. And there's a lot of people there that are on the right track. And the one thing that encourages me is I never look and say, well, I need to go out there. One of my biggest rallies I had in the presidential campaign was at Berkeley, believe it or not. I mean, it was huge. But if I went there and thought, well, I got to get 51% of the people at Berkeley agreeing with this, it would be just too devastating. And but there's always some there, and in large numbers, and they're enthusiastic. And a young person, if they get the right information, they realize that they have a lot at stake. And I think it's very encouraging on what's happening, and that there's reason to believe that some good can come of this. I keep thinking of this in the big picture, and the big picture for me is what's happened, for literally hundreds, if not thousands of years about the human race developing. Not much really happened, in the sense of technical developments up until about 300 years ago. You think of what was before that. There was a lot of fancy things, but really the fantastic technology, and even today technology is improving the living condition. And yet every time we improve the living condition, it seems like we use the technology not only for some people's living condition improving, but it's also used to fight wars and kill people more efficiently, drop bigger bombs, and get more involved. But the people who understand this realize that there could be a different way. Why is it that if we made this great change in the human race by technology, and just in the last 100 years, really, there's been fantastic technological advances. But what about the human race advancing otherwise? Why can't we advance on how we get along together? That would be a real chore, wouldn't it? But, I still come down on the side that I think most people are decent, but not in Washington. Washington's a different story. Because, well, anyway, why they go there is a different story. But no, I keep thinking, my wife and I, raising kids, we lived in several states and 5-6 different houses, and we had neighborhoods. I can't remember once where I worried about my neighbor. My neighbors were always good neighbors. Sometimes we didn't talk much, but we never had to worry about them, and sometimes they would help each other. So I think I think there's more goodness in people than we give them credit for. I think the problem is that the people who like authoritarianism, tell people what to do. They know it's illegal for an individual to go into your house and take what they want. Fortunately, that moral standard still exists. You can't personally take from people and hurt people. It happens, but basically most people recognize you can't do it. But it's not illegal for the government to do it. This is why it's so important. If there are some good rules for us to have a good community and getting along with people, we as a country and as a people, what we have to do is hold the feet to the fire of government, where those individuals that go to government are not allowed to use force or violence to try to have their way in any way whatsoever. That, I think, would make a difference. And there is only one rule you have to think about, and it's not a complex rule. I mean, we have what are the Keynesian interventionists and people who want to manage these interventions for? Boy, you have to have a lot of rules, and figure out, well, you do it on this hand, and on this hand you do this, write more regulations and all. But there's only one rule that you need, and that is the rule that we apply to ourselves. We don't have a right to hurt people. We don't have a right to steal from people. And those are ancient traditions, thousands of years old. Plain and simple, don't lie, cheat, steal, or kill. And yet we have governments involved probably in killing. Who knows what? So we certainly have our government involved in killing, with these undeclared, illegal, immoral wars. Like a million Iraqis have died since we went in there to save that country. It's just utterly tragic what goes on. So how do you do that? I think the founders tried to solve that problem. They tried to give us what they called a republic, keep the government very small, advise us to stay out of entangling alliances, allow a national defense, but it didn't work. So how do you do it if it's natural for people who love authoritarianism to go where they can use their authoritarianism, and it hasn't worked? So what is the other option? I think the other option is we need to change our idea of what the nature of government is. And that is, don't permit a government that can do these things. And if we could just allow that to happen, when it happens, people do so much better. It's not like they don't. It's not like if tomorrow all government was wiped out in a minute with medical care. Believe me, there would be some adjustments pretty fast. Fees would come down a whole lot, let me tell you. And the insurance company wouldn't be breaking off the top. And the drug companies wouldn't be abusing the system. The management companies that are involved. All that expense that we've experienced for the last, not only on Obamacare, because the Republicans have introduced a lot of that too. It's government intervention that caused all these prices to go up. So if you eliminated all these middlemen, believe me, it would be so much better. Even today, under these conditions, there are people who stake out totally private hospital and they just take cash and that's it. And they're out of the system, and it actually worked. So when we have difficult situations like this, and we're trying to find out who the real enemies are, what we have to do is make sure there's always a loophole for everybody to opt out. That was probably the most onerous thing about Obamacare, that you couldn't get out. You had to be pushed into that thing. But you ought to always be able to opt out. The educational system, in a way, has an opt-out in it. We can get out of it, even though it's not universally available. But they did try in the 80s to make sure that you couldn't homeschool your kids, and there was an attack on homeschooling and private schooling, and they want to regulate private schools still. But if you can get out of the system, and if they eliminate any option to get out, whether it's medical care or education, that is very, very bad. And we're at that point where opting out is more difficult. So I think this is one thing that we could do. But I believe that this is a non-viable system that we have, and the enemies are more philosophic than they are just individuals who are misled. I think there's a philosophy behind it. I think cultural Marxism isn't accidental of people who was gently misled. They have goals to cause chaos, cultural chaos, for a strategy to destroy, the culture that we have. And sometimes we come up with these questions about how do you protect civil liberties and protect everybody's religious liberties and sexual liberties inside, public institutions. Well, the best way is get rid of the public institution. and then if it's a private institution, if it's a religious institution or a private institution, you get to write your own rules. Oh, well, that introduces some other problems. That means that you might have to make choices on who can come and who can go. Well, in freedom, actually, you are allowed to make your own choices. And one other word that they've destroyed is to be discriminatory. We're all discriminatory. Everything we do, you made a choice to come here. I made a choice to stay away from Chantilly. Now, we always make these choices. It's constant. But they want to make you believe that you're not allowed to pick and choose. Well, we do. We pick our people who come into our house. We pick schools and all these things. So it's constantly making choices, but they don't want to. Somebody else is supposed to make those decisions for us, and that is what's so hard for people to understand. Is in civil liberties, if people use their liberties we might not like, how can we tolerate them because we don't agree with them on this? If they do the one thing, don't use force, and we just sort of say, you mind your own business, do what you want, call yourselves whatever you want, but you cannot take your standards and push them and force them on somebody else. Society would work, but the people who are in opposition to us, they're not looking for peace and tranquility. They're looking for chaos, and right now they're on the verge of getting their chaos. But we have to always look for a solution and an opportunity. The one other issue I want to touch on before I close, and that is the privacy issue. Because we do want to be safe and we do want to be secure, and there's a room for a little bit of surveillance, but it should be strict. It should be strict. And the founders thought about this. This mass surveillance of all Americans, this is atrocious. But if you had the whole system of having search warrants and all, and there are so many solutions. There's one agency, I don't know whether anybody here has ever been annoyed by TSA. Anybody in this room been annoyed by TSA? I'd like to get rid of the TSA. And I voted against the TSA. It should be private. It should be the private people dealing with their customers. And that means there's technology now where they can scan people so fast. And that's one part of technology that wouldn't destroy productive jobs, because the TSA agents would have to go get a productive job, and we would have better security than ever before. So but privacy is very, very important, and that is a principle of liberty. But the solution is understanding where the importance of our life, liberty, and our property, and that it's a natural right, and it's come to us in a natural ways, in a beneficial way. And if we have enough people, and believe me, it doesn't need 51%, it needs 10% at the most to change people's attitudes, and that's why you're here, and that's why you're part of that group, and that's why you can have a lot of influence, and that's why I'm optimistic. I want to thank you very much today.
We have a 25-minute break, and we got appetizers out in the hallway.
You're watching